In the closing years of the 19th century, the world trembled between empires and revolutions. From the smoke of old wars rose one voice that would, decades later, stand firm against the coming storm: Winston Spencer Churchill. Was he a man born of destiny, or simply the will of one who refused to yield? Wherever you are listening from, share your thoughts below and subscribe so we may journey together through this reflection on history and courage. England, 1874. The Victorian age was at its height. The British Empire stretched across continents, its influence marked not only by trade and conquest, but by the quiet assurance of a nation that believed in its permanence. In this vast empire, amid the privileges and constraints of aristocracy, a child was born who would later stand against the very tide of history itself. His name was Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. He was born on the 30th of November in Blenheim Palace, a place of immense beauty and cold grandeur. The palace was not merely a home, it was a monument to his ancestor, John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, the victorious commander at the Battle of Blenheim. The lineage carried pride and expectation, but also a burden. The young Churchill would grow up in the shadow of that family name, conscious always of the greatness it demanded. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a man of intellect, wit, and ambition. In the political world of late Victorian Britain, Randolph was a figure of energy and controversy, brilliant in debate, quick to anger, and determined to shape the Conservative Party into a new force for reform. Yet beneath his achievements lay restlessness and an illness that would claim him early. His rise was meteoric, his fall tragic. To Winston, his father was both an idol and a mystery, a man admired from afar, seldom embraced up close. Jenny Jerome, Winston's mother, was American, born in Brooklyn, raised in a world of enterprise and movement, so different from the English aristocracy she married into. Her beauty was renowned, her charm and independence equally so. To her son, she was a figure of fascination, of warmth, but also of distance. Winston would later write that his mother shone like the evening star, bright, beautiful, and unattainable. The young boy's affection often met with absence. His parents, absorbed in politics and society, left much of his care to nannies and tutors. Childhood for Winston was not gentle. He was a sensitive child, quick to speak, quicker to imagine, yet often misunderstood. Letters written from his boarding school reveal a boy seeking attention and love, writing repeatedly to his mother for visits that seldom came. At Harrow, one of Britain's most prestigious schools, he was neither top of his class nor especially obedient. Teachers saw in him flashes of intelligence clouded by impatience and indiscipline. But there was in him a fierce independence, a refusal to be shaped entirely by authority. The world around him was changing. The British Empire, though mighty, was showing the strain of its vastness. Industrial progress had brought wealth and power, but also inequality and unrest. The echoes of war in distant colonies reached London through the press, tales of bravery, conquest, and rebellion. For a boy like Winston, growing in a household where courage and rhetoric were equally admired, these stories stirred a longing for adventure and purpose. It was in these formative years that his imagination began to feed on military history. He devoured tales of battles, of generals and statesmen. He saw in war not only peril, but the stage upon which greatness could be proven. It was not the love of violence that drew him, but the drama of decision, the testing of character, and the endurance of the human will. In his mind, leadership was not simply power, it was duty, the capacity to act when others could not. At home, tensions often lingered. Lord Randolph's health was deteriorating. His once bright political star had dimmed. His career, marked by flashes of brilliance, ended in bitterness and misunderstanding. Winston watched from a child's distance as his father withdrew from public life. Their relationship remained strained, a mixture of reverence and rejection. The boy's letters pleading for affection were rarely answered in kind. When his father died at 45, Winston was 20. He would later confess that he had spent his youth preparing speeches he hoped would earn his father's praise, speeches that would never be heard. Between the silences of his parents, Winston learned the habit of self-reliance. His determination to prove himself, in the classroom, in the military, and later in Parliament, grew from the void of approval he never received. The loneliness of childhood became the fuel of ambition. He once wrote, "Solitary trees, if they grow at all, grow strong." Those words, written much later in life, might well have been a reflection of his own youth. Beyond the private realm, the age itself was one of confidence. Britain ruled the seas. Queen Victoria had become an emblem of empire. The ideals of honour, service and sacrifice shaped the education of young men destined for leadership. For Winston, these values merged with personal longing. He sought not just success, but significance, the chance to take part in history, to stand where choices mattered. At Harrow, his oratory began to take form. He was not an academic prodigy, but he possessed a natural gift for language, rhythm, phrasing, and persuasion. Words, he discovered, could move men as surely as armies. Even as a teenager, he practiced speech writing in private, mimicking the great voices of Parliament. He understood instinctively that rhetoric, when united with conviction, was a force as real as steel or gunpowder. In these early years, Churchill's path seemed uncertain, yet one thread remained constant: the belief that destiny awaited those who prepared to meet it. When he left school for Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy, he did so not merely to serve, but to learn command. The discipline of the cavalry, the study of tactics, and the structure of the armed forces gave him a framework within which his restless energy could find direction. Few could have imagined that the young cadet, often ridiculed for his arrogance and eccentricity, would one day command the confidence of a nation. But history rarely reveals its intentions early. In the quiet corridors of Sandhurst, among rows of uniforms and maps, the seeds of determination took root. Churchill would later recall those years not as a time of glory, but of awakening. He began to understand the cost of courage, the need for preparation, and the meaning of endurance. The young man who once sought his father's approval now looked toward the larger world, ready to make his own name known. The empire, still vast and confident, would soon call upon him, and he would answer. When Winston Churchill entered the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, he was a young man filled with energy, pride, and a measure of uncertainty. The year was 1893. The world outside the academy was one of imperial confidence and rising modernity. Yet within its walls, the traditions of discipline and service remained untouched by time. The daily rhythm of drills, commands, and inspections stood in sharp contrast to his years of restless imagination. For the first time, he faced an institution that demanded obedience before brilliance. It was here that the foundations of his character would be tested, reshaped, and hardened. The military world did not come naturally to him at first. He had little patience for routine and a limited sense of hierarchy. Yet amid the strict discipline and unrelenting structure, Churchill discovered a purpose that education had not given him. The clarity of military life, its order and precision, gave shape to his ambitions. For every rule he questioned, there was a skill to master: marksmanship, riding, strategy, endurance. He excelled, not through compliance, but through determination. When others tired, he persisted. When others accepted limits, he sought to exceed them. The academy, which had broken many young men of weaker spirit, became for Churchill a crucible through which his confidence was forged. Outside the drill fields, he immersed himself in the study of past wars. The campaigns of Napoleon, the writings of Caesar, the struggles of the American Civil War, these became his teachers. He read not for entertainment, but for insight into leadership and decision-making. To him, history was a living conversation between men and their circumstances, a guide to understanding the balance between courage and prudence. The idea of command fascinated him, how one voice could alter the fate of many. It was not power he sought, but the test of will that power demanded. Sandhurst gave him the first sense that he might one day stand in that position himself. By the time he graduated in 1894, Churchill had transformed. No longer the unfocused boy of Harrow, he had become a man of ambition and direction. Commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, he looked upon his uniform not merely as attire, but as a symbol of belonging, a declaration that he would seek adventure wherever it might lead. The Empire offered no shortage of such opportunities. Britain's reach extended across continents, and with it came constant conflict at the edges of control. For young officers like Churchill, the world was both battlefield and classroom. In his early letters, one can trace the tone of growing purpose. He wrote often to his mother, not only to report his progress, but to seek her influence in advancing his career. Jenny Churchill, ever connected and persuasive, became his quiet ally. Through her, he sought assignments that would place him closer to action and recognition. The relationship between mother and son, once distant, began to evolve into a partnership of ambition. She admired his courage. He relied on her charm and connections. Their correspondence reveals a mutual understanding that fame was both an armour and a weapon in the modern age. Before long, his regiment was assigned to India, the jewel of the British Empire. To many officers, it was an exotic but tedious posting, a place of heat, monotony, and ceremonial duty. To Churchill, it was a door to discovery. The voyage to Bombay marked his first step into the wider world. The vastness of the empire, its peoples, and its contradictions stirred in him a mixture of pride and questioning. As the ship approached the Indian coast, he gazed upon the horizon with the awareness that history, for some, begins not in birth, but in the moment of departure. In India, he balanced the duties of an officer with the curiosity of a scholar. He spent his days in uniform and his nights in study. Philosophy, politics, and literature became his companions. He read the works of Gibbon, Plato, and Darwin. He examined the structures of empire and the causes of its endurance. He questioned, though quietly, the moral burden of imperial power. Yet he remained loyal to the idea of Britain's mission, the belief, common in his age, that the empire brought order and progress to distant lands. If doubts existed, they were philosophical, not rebellious. The practical soldier and the reflective thinker began to coexist within him. Military exercises under the Indian sun tested his endurance. The dust, the heat, the long marches across barren landscapes, all these hardened him physically and disciplined him mentally. His letters from this period reveal both weariness and wonder. He wrote of the beauty of the land, of the courage of local soldiers, and of the complex tapestry of faiths and traditions. For a man who would one day govern through words, these early encounters with diversity shaped his understanding of humanity beyond the borders of Britain. The sense of adventure that had filled his youth deepened into a hunger for experience. He longed for real combat, for the chance to prove his courage in the face of danger. He believed, as many young men of his generation did, that glory was the truest path to distinction. When the opportunity came to serve in active campaigns on the northwest frontier, he seized it. It was there, amid the harsh mountains and sudden skirmishes, that he first heard the sound of bullets flying close and felt the uncertainty of survival. Fear, he would later recall, is a companion that reveals the measure of a man. In these encounters, Churchill displayed both audacity and reflection. His superiors noted his bravery, his peers, his unusual composure under fire. Yet what set him apart was not only courage, but his ability to record what he saw. His letters and reports, vivid and precise, caught the attention of editors back home. He began writing for newspapers, describing the realities of the frontier with a voice both descriptive and analytical. Through these writings he found a new weapon, not the sword, but the pen. Words could carry his image and his ideas farther than any uniform could. For Churchill, the soldier and the writer were no longer separate roles. They were two expressions of one ambition. By the close of the decade, his reputation was growing. He was known not only as a promising officer, but as a man with something to say. His observations revealed a mind aware of both the limits and the possibilities of empire. Yet, behind his rising confidence, there remained the echo of personal insecurity, the need to prove to himself and to the memory of his father that he was capable of greatness. Each success seemed a step toward redemption, though for what, he could not fully define. Perhaps it was for the neglect of youth, or perhaps for the unspoken expectations that lingered in his name. As he stood at the edge of his early military career, Churchill sensed that his path would not remain confined to the regiment. The battlefield had given him courage, but the world of politics and ideas called more strongly. In India, he had tested his will. In the years ahead, he would test his vision. The young officer who once struggled under the weight of discipline had learned its value. From defiance, he had drawn direction, and though he did not yet know it, the experiences of these years would become the foundation upon which he would later bear the heaviest responsibility a man can hold, the defence of a nation's hope. By the time Churchill's regiment was settled in India, the young officer had begun to view his service not as an end, but as a beginning. The empire, vast and complex, offered him both adventure and reflection. To others, India was a distant outpost of duty. To Churchill, it was a theatre of discovery. The sights, the colours, the layered sounds of marketplaces and parades, the rhythm of monsoon rains upon stone, all of it expanded his imagination. He felt the immensity of the world pressing upon his thoughts, and recognized that he was part of something larger than himself, something ancient, contradictory, and enduring. In this setting, far from the reserved manners of English society, he began to form his own identity, that of a man destined to engage with history rather than merely observe it. The young officer spent long evenings in his quarters, reading under the dim light of an oil lamp. Volumes of philosophy, politics, and military theory lay scattered around his desk. He studied Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, not for entertainment, but for instruction. In the fate of Rome, he saw the reflection of power's fragility, how decadence and complacency could undo the mightiest civilization. He read Darwin and Spencer, absorbing their theories of evolution and progress, though he would later question their moral implications. These readings, combined with his own experiences, awakened in him the belief that the strength of a nation rested not solely on arms, but upon the courage and conscience of its leaders. During his service, Churchill encountered the harsh realities of empire. The northwest frontier, with its mountainous terrain and rebellious tribes, tested both his body and spirit. Skirmishes with local forces revealed the limitations of strategy and the unpredictability of warfare. For the first time, he witnessed death not as an abstract concept of heroism, but as a tangible presence. The sight of fallen comrades and wounded men left a mark upon him, not of despair, but of solemn understanding. He realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. His reports from these battles, written with precision and restraint, carried home to Britain a tone of clarity unusual for one so young. They displayed not only the facts of conflict, but also the weight of human endurance that war imposed. It was through these writings that Churchill's name began to circulate beyond military circles. Newspapers in London published his accounts, and readers were struck by their combination of vividness and thought. He did not glorify war, but neither did he condemn it. He saw it as a test of men, of governments, of ideas. The clarity of his prose, the measured rhythm of his sentences, revealed a mind already disciplined by observation. He wrote as both participant and historian, recording what he saw with a calm that suggested not detachment, but purpose. Through the act of writing, he discovered a form of power that did not rely on command. Words could reach where swords could not. Between military campaigns, Churchill continued his education through correspondence and self-discipline. He studied economics, governance, and the workings of Parliament. The officers' mess was his lecture hall, debates with peers, his training ground in rhetoric. While others sought leisure, he pursued ambition. Yet there was no vanity in his striving, only a belief that life was a series of opportunities that demanded preparation. In letters to his mother, he often expressed both impatience and determination, aware that time was precious. Jenny Churchill, ever supportive and socially adept, helped her son publish his writings and cultivate influential contacts in London. Her encouragement gave him not comfort, but momentum. In 1897, he volunteered for service with the Malakand Field Force, where British troops engaged in fierce fighting against tribal insurgents. The campaign was arduous, fought across rugged terrain under oppressive heat. Churchill observed how leadership and morale determined outcomes as much as weapons did. He admired courage in others and began to sense his own appetite for command. Yet he also recognized the fragility of human judgment in the chaos of war. His notes from this period, later expanded into his first book, The Story of the Malakand Field Force, reflected not the arrogance of victory, but the curiosity of a student of history. The book's publication the following year brought him recognition beyond the military world. Critics noted its clarity and lack of exaggeration, qualities rare among young officers writing about war. Success did not bring him contentment. Churchill was restless. He saw military life as a preparation for something greater, though he could not yet define it. The regiment, with its routines and hierarchies, began to feel restrictive. He admired the courage of his comrades, but felt constrained by the limits of a soldier's influence. Decisions of consequence were made far from the front by politicians and statesmen who shaped the course of nations. Gradually, he began to imagine a future beyond the uniform, a place where his voice, rather than his sword, might serve his country. His next assignment came in 1898, when he joined the British forces in Egypt to serve under General Kitchener during the campaign against the Mahdist uprising in Sudan. The journey along the Nile, the assembly of modern weaponry, and the organisation of troops from across the empire left a deep impression on him. The Battle of Omdurman that followed was swift and decisive, a demonstration of industrial age warfare against a determined but ill-equipped enemy. Churchill rode with the cavalry charge, a dramatic, perilous assault that left hundreds dead in moments. The experience shocked him. It revealed the terrible efficiency of modern arms and the widening gap between courage and technology. He emerged from the battle alive, but altered. War, he realized, was no longer a contest of valor. It had become a machinery of destruction governed by progress itself. In The River War, his detailed account of the campaign, Churchill wrote not only as a witness, but as a thinker. He questioned the morality of imperial conquest, even as he defended its necessity. He praised bravery, but lamented the waste of human potential. His words hinted at an evolving awareness that empire carried both pride and peril. Though he remained a servant of it, he saw its contradictions with increasing clarity. This ability to see two truths at once, loyalty and doubt, duty and conscience, would later define his political life. When he returned to England, Churchill found himself at a crossroads. His military achievements and publications had earned him fame and modest wealth. Yet he sensed that soldiering alone could no longer contain his ambition. The allure of politics began to draw him. The House of Commons, with its debates and decisions, seemed a new battlefield, one where strategy was measured in words and influence rather than in bullets and blood. He once remarked that the pen and the sword are both powerful, but that the former can draw blood without being seen. In that conviction lay the seed of his next transformation. As he prepared for this new chapter, the world itself was changing. The Victorian era was waning. The certainty of empire was giving way to questions of social reform, labour rights, and technological upheaval. The 20th century approached with both promise and foreboding. Churchill, now in his mid-20s, stood poised between two worlds, the old order of hierarchy and the emerging age of individual conviction. He carried within him the lessons of discipline and the scars of defiance, ready to turn them into a force that would soon move beyond the military field and into the heart of political power. When Winston Churchill arrived in South Africa in 1899, the empire was once again at war. The Boer conflict, fought between the British forces and the independent Boer republics, had captured the attention of the world. It was a struggle not of vast armies, but of endurance, tactics, and political will. Churchill did not come as a soldier this time, but as a correspondent, a civilian observer seeking both adventure and recognition. The transition from officer to writer was deliberate. He understood that the modern age valued not only courage in battle, but the ability to communicate it. To shape public opinion was, in its own way, a form of command. He joined the campaign with the energy of youth and the confidence of experience. The Boer War, though distant from the heart of the empire, carried immense symbolic weight. It was seen as a test of Britain's resolve and of the future of imperial unity. Churchill's dispatches, published in London newspapers, combined precise description with restrained emotion. He chronicled the long marches, the confusion of engagements, the dust and heat that exhausted both men and horses. He wrote of courage and fear, of officers striving to impose order upon uncertainty. His tone was balanced, never sentimental, never sensational. Yet beneath the surface there was always an undercurrent of admiration for endurance and resolve. In November of that year, while travelling aboard an armoured train near Chieveley, Churchill's journey took a dramatic turn. The train was ambushed by Boer forces. Carriages derailed under shell fire. Amid the chaos, Churchill helped organise the defence and assisted in the evacuation of the wounded. Despite his efforts, he was captured. For most men, such an event would have marked humiliation or despair. For Churchill, it became a moment of transformation. As a prisoner of war in Pretoria, he endured confinement with patience and calculation. His letters from captivity reveal no bitterness, only determination. He regarded his situation not as defeat, but as an opportunity to test his will against circumstance. After weeks of careful planning, he escaped. The details of the escape, the scaling of walls, the silent journey through enemy territory, the reliance on strangers for shelter, would later enter the realm of legend. Yet Churchill himself would recount it with measured restraint, emphasising not heroism but persistence. He travelled by night, hid by day, and finally reached safety in Portuguese East Africa. His return to British lines brought celebration, but more importantly, it brought recognition. Newspapers in London hailed him as a national hero, a young man of daring and intellect who had defied the odds. The story of his escape spread quickly, cementing his image as a figure of courage and resourcefulness. Back in England, his fame preceded him. His reports from the war, now read with renewed interest, carried the authority of one who had faced captivity and triumphed over it. He published London to Ladysmith via Pretoria, a detailed account of his experiences. The book, though restrained in tone, carried the rhythm of endurance, a narrative of persistence rather than triumph. It revealed a writer who could balance observation with self-awareness, and who understood that the measure of an event lay not in its drama, but in its consequence. Readers admired his courage. Critics praised his style. Churchill, barely in his mid-20s, had achieved what few could at any age, the status of a public figure whose name was known across the empire. Yet fame did not distract him from reflection. The war, despite its glory in the press, exposed the difficulties of imperial rule and the cost of maintaining dominance across distant lands. Churchill, who had once viewed empire as a symbol of progress, began to perceive its limits. The courage of the Boers, their stubborn defence of independence, stirred in him a degree of respect. He wrote of them not as enemies, but as men of conviction. This nuance distinguished him from many of his contemporaries. It was not sympathy that moved him, but understanding, a recognition that power must always be balanced by purpose. Upon returning home in 1900, Churchill's ambitions turned decisively toward politics. He had proven his courage in battle and his intellect in writing. Now he sought to serve through governance. The path from soldier to statesman was neither accidental nor abrupt. For him it was the natural progression of service, first through action, then through words, and finally through decision. His lectures across Britain drew large audiences. His speeches, marked by clarity and conviction, revealed a command of language that would later become his greatest strength. He spoke of courage, responsibility, and the duty of government to act with both strength and compassion. His manner was confident, yet his tone remained rooted in reason rather than rhetoric. In the general election of 1900, Churchill stood as the Conservative candidate for Oldham. The campaign tested his resilience. He faced seasoned opponents, sceptical voters, and the complexities of a changing nation. Britain, though victorious in South Africa, was beginning to question the cost of its empire. Industrial unrest, social inequality, and calls for reform were shaping the political landscape. Churchill's speeches reflected these tensions. He defended national strength, but also emphasised fairness and opportunity. He spoke not as a representative of privilege, but as a man who believed in merit and perseverance. The electorate responded. He won his seat and entered Parliament at the age of 26. The moment marked the beginning of a new phase in his life, one that would test his intellect more than his courage, and his patience more than his will. In Parliament, the rules of engagement were different. The weapons were words, and the battles were fought over ideas and policy. Churchill's maiden speeches were noted for their eloquence, but also for their independence. He was not easily confined by party lines or traditions. His allegiance was to principle rather than faction, and his mind, trained by experience, saw politics as an extension of history itself, a continuous negotiation between power and conscience. Looking back, one can see that the years in South Africa did more than bring him fame. They taught him endurance and perspective. The experience of capture and escape, of fear and resolve, prepared him for the uncertainties of political life. He had learned that courage without reflection was reckless, but reflection without courage was futile. The balance between these two, action and thought, would define his public life for decades to come. As he took his seat in the House of Commons for the first time, the echoes of distant battles still lingered in his memory, reminding him that leadership, in whatever form it took, was a test not only of strength, but of purpose. When Winston Churchill entered Parliament in 1900, he brought with him not only the prestige of his military adventures, but also the self-assurance of a man who had already tested himself against danger and public scrutiny. The House of Commons was a different battlefield, quieter perhaps, but no less demanding. It required patience, persuasion, and the discipline of listening as well as speaking. The grandeur of Westminster, with its echoing chambers and weight of centuries, seemed to welcome him and challenge him at once. Churchill, barely 26, understood that the institution he was joining was both a guardian of tradition and a battleground of ideas. He was determined to make his mark quickly, not through deference, but through distinction. The early years of his parliamentary life revealed both his brilliance and his restlessness. As a member of the Conservative Party, he found himself increasingly at odds with the rigid hierarchies and cautious policies that defined its leadership. Churchill's outlook was progressive for his class and time. He believed that the strength of Britain depended not only on empire and industry, but on the welfare and opportunity of its people. He argued for social reforms, education, and workers' protections, ideas that unsettled many of his conservative colleagues. They saw in him a spirit too independent to be contained by loyalty to party. Churchill, however, believed that loyalty to country outweighed all else. The tensions between conviction and conformity soon became too great to ignore. By 1904, he made a decisive and controversial choice. He crossed the floor of the House to join the Liberal Party. It was a move that shocked many and angered more. His former allies saw betrayal. His new colleagues saw ambition. For Churchill, it was neither. He later explained that his change of allegiance was not a change of heart, but a return to principle. The Liberals, under the leadership of men like Herbert Asquith and David Lloyd George, were advancing policies aimed at social improvement, free trade, and a more inclusive democracy. Churchill believed these were the true instruments of national strength. It was not empire alone that sustained Britain, he argued, but the fairness with which it treated its citizens. Within the Liberal ranks, Churchill quickly rose in prominence. His speeches combined logic with vividness, drawing both admiration and criticism. He spoke with a rhythm and clarity that made his arguments difficult to dismiss. His command of language, honed through years of reading and reflection, gave him an advantage that few could match. Yet it was not eloquence alone that defined him. He possessed an uncommon energy, an ability to work relentlessly, to absorb detail, and to anticipate the arguments of others. This combination of intellect and endurance marked him as a formidable force in debate. In 1908, at the age of 33, Churchill was appointed President of the Board of Trade, his first significant position in government. The office placed him at the centre of Britain's social and economic policy. He introduced labour exchanges to assist the unemployed, pushed for improved working conditions, and supported the introduction of old age pensions, measures that laid the foundations for what would later be known as the welfare state. His reforms were practical, not ideological. He believed that government should act as a stabilising force, ensuring that prosperity was shared, and that hardship did not lead to unrest. To him, social reform was not a concession to weakness, but a safeguard of strength. His partnership with David Lloyd George during these years was one of both cooperation and rivalry. Together, they pursued a program of progressive legislation that challenged established interests. Yet both men were aware of the political risks. The upper classes and traditional institutions viewed such reforms with suspicion, seeing them as threats to privilege and property. Churchill, however, faced criticism with composure. He once remarked that to be attacked for doing what one believes to be right is among the highest forms of flattery. His confidence was not arrogance. It was the conviction that progress required courage. Beyond politics, his personal life was also evolving. In 1908, he married Clementine Hosier, a woman of intelligence, grace, and quiet strength. Their union brought him stability and companionship. Clementine's understanding of his nature, his ambition, his temper, his moments of solitude, provided balance to his restless energy. She was both confidant and critic, offering counsel in moments of doubt and restraint in times of passion. Their correspondence throughout their marriage reveals a relationship built on respect and enduring affection. In her presence, Churchill found the calm that public life so often denied him. As his career advanced, his responsibilities expanded. He became Home Secretary in 1910, a role that tested his principles against the realities of power. The early 20th century was a time of social tension in Britain. Labour strikes, demands for Irish Home Rule, and the movement for women's suffrage challenged the government's capacity for order and reform. Churchill approached these crises with a mixture of firmness and empathy. He believed that authority must be maintained, but that justice should temper its application. His handling of industrial unrest was criticised by both sides, by those who saw him as too harsh and by others who called him too lenient. Yet in his own mind, he sought not to please either faction, but to preserve stability. It was during these years that his understanding of leadership deepened. He saw that governance was less about command than about balance, between competing interests, between idealism and necessity. His speeches in Parliament grew more reflective, his tone more measured. He warned against the dangers of extremism in all forms, recognising that political life demanded both conviction and compromise. Though his confidence remained unshaken, there were moments when he sensed the isolation that leadership inevitably brings. To stand at the centre of decision-making was to stand at times alone. In the years leading up to the First World War, Churchill's focus turned increasingly toward national defence. He accepted the post of First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911, taking responsibility for the Royal Navy. The appointment marked his transition from domestic reformer to strategist of empire. He recognised that the peace of Europe was fragile and that Britain's security depended upon preparedness. The rapid militarisation of Germany troubled him deeply. He foresaw that technology was changing the nature of warfare and that naval supremacy, once unquestioned, could not be taken for granted. Under his direction, the Navy was modernised. New ships, new armaments, and new tactics were introduced. It was a transformation guided not by fear, but by foresight. Churchill's energy during this period was remarkable. He immersed himself in the details of naval design, shipbuilding, and logistics. His insistence on innovation, particularly the development of oil-fueled vessels, met resistance from traditionalists. Yet he persisted. He believed that adaptability was the essence of strength. The lessons he had learned as a young soldier in India and Sudan now guided his vision for the defence of the nation. He understood that technology and leadership must evolve together, or both would fail. As Europe edged toward conflict, Churchill's warnings grew more urgent. He spoke of the need for vigilance, for diplomacy supported by readiness. His speeches were not calls for war, but for prudence. He sensed, earlier than most, that the old balance of power was eroding. His contemporaries often dismissed his concerns as alarmist, but in his mind preparation was not pessimism, it was duty. The shadow of his father's early death and unfulfilled ambition lingered still, driving him to act decisively, to prove through service what could not be achieved through inheritance. The years between 1900 and 1914 marked Churchill's evolution from adventurer to statesman. The youthful soldier of empire had become a man of governance, still ambitious, but tempered by experience. He had faced opposition, risked reputation, and endured the shifting tides of political fortune. Yet through all these changes, one quality remained constant, an unwavering belief in the capacity of courage and intellect to shape destiny. The path ahead would test that belief as never before, for history was preparing to open its most perilous chapter, and Churchill would soon find himself standing at its centre. By 1911, Winston Churchill had ascended to one of the most critical offices of the British Empire, First Lord of the Admiralty. It was a position that carried immense weight, and he approached it with characteristic vigour and precision. The Royal Navy, long regarded as the symbol of Britain's power and security, stood at the heart of his attention. The Empire's survival, Churchill believed, rested upon command of the seas. In that conviction, he saw not nostalgia for past glories, but an urgent necessity for adaptation. The world was changing swiftly. Industrial progress had introduced new forms of warfare, and the rivalries between nations were growing ever more intricate. Churchill sensed that the peace Europe had enjoyed for decades was brittle, and that the next war, should it come, would be unlike any before it. He devoted himself entirely to the modernization of the Navy. He visited shipyards, spoke with engineers, and absorbed the technicalities of design and propulsion with the same enthusiasm that had once driven his studies of military history. He promoted the shift from coal to oil fuel, a transformation that promised speed and efficiency but demanded foresight and investment. Many within the Admiralty resisted the change, citing tradition and cost, but Churchill pressed forward. He believed that inaction was the greater risk. Under his direction, new classes of battleships were conceived, faster and more heavily armed. The dreadnought, already a symbol of naval supremacy, became a platform for innovation. He insisted that the Navy's future lay in readiness, in the constant pursuit of improvement. His energy was formidable, his attention to detail unrelenting. Admirals who had served through decades of peacetime found themselves challenged by a civilian minister whose grasp of their profession seemed uncanny. Churchill did not merely oversee, he participated. He demanded reports, questioned assumptions, and introduced reforms with a pace that left some uneasy. Yet even his critics admitted his brilliance. He possessed the rare ability to see strategy not only in maps and figures, but in human terms. He understood that behind every fleet and formation were men, sailors whose discipline and morale would decide the outcome of any conflict. To lead them, one must first earn their confidence. Churchill made it his duty to visit naval bases, to speak directly with officers and crews. His presence inspired respect. They saw in him not merely authority, but genuine understanding. The political world around him, however, was far less stable. The early years of the 20th century were marked by social unrest, the Irish question, and the growing demands for suffrage. Churchill's position required him to balance military foresight with domestic responsibility. In cabinet meetings, he often clashed with colleagues who regarded his sense of urgency as excessive. Yet Churchill's mind was fixed on the broader horizon. He studied the ambitions of Germany with particular concern. The German Empire, under Kaiser Wilhelm II, had built a navy that challenged Britain's long-standing supremacy. The arms race between the two nations had intensified, and Churchill viewed it not merely as competition, but as the manifestation of a deeper tension, a struggle between opposing visions of order and power. He advocated for alliances and preparedness, not for aggression, but for deterrence. He understood that the balance of strength was the only true guarantee of peace. His speeches in the House of Commons during this period reflected both warning and restraint. He urged investment in defence but spoke equally of the moral responsibility that came with power. To be strong, he argued, is to be capable of restraint. His words carried a tone of reflection rare in the political debates of the time. To many, he seemed prophetic, though few were prepared to accept the scale of the danger he foresaw. When the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo set Europe on the path to war in 1914, Churchill's preparations at the Admiralty proved decisive. Within hours of Britain's declaration of war, the fleet was mobilised and ready. The transition from peace to conflict, though wrenching, was executed with precision. Churchill worked tirelessly in those first days, coordinating operations, communicating with allies, and ensuring that the Royal Navy secured vital sea routes. The burden of command weighed heavily upon him, yet he bore it with resolve. To him, this was not a war of conquest, but of endurance, a struggle for civilization itself. He saw in Germany's militarism a threat not only to Britain, but to the principles of liberty and balance that he believed sustained the world order. The outbreak of war also brought with it the first great test of his leadership. Decisions made in haste carried enormous consequence. Every movement of the fleet, every deployment of resources had to be measured against the risk of loss. Churchill felt deeply the responsibility of each command he signed. Behind every order were lives, and the knowledge of that weight never left him. Yet his instinct was always for action. He believed that hesitation was more dangerous than decision, even when the outcome could not be fully known. This tendency would bring both triumph and tragedy in the years to come. The early naval engagements of the war demonstrated both the strength and vulnerability of modern warfare. The Battle of Heligoland Bight in August 1914 brought Britain its first victory, though at the cost of lives that reminded the nation of war's gravity. Churchill visited wounded sailors, speaking to them quietly, without ceremony. He saw in their faces the courage that words could scarcely express. To him, their sacrifice reaffirmed the justice of the cause, even as it deepened his understanding of its price. In the months that followed, Churchill's focus expanded beyond the sea. He became involved in broader strategic discussions, advocating for bold actions that might break the stalemate of trench warfare on the Western Front. His imagination, always fertile, sought new solutions where others saw only attrition. It was during these deliberations that the idea of striking through the Dardanelles at Gallipoli began to take shape, a plan that would later define the most painful chapter of his early career. But in 1914 and 1915, it appeared to many as a daring alternative, a way to outflank the enemy and relieve pressure on the exhausted armies of France. Churchill supported the plan with conviction, believing that audacity might succeed where convention had failed. Even in the midst of mounting pressures, he found moments of reflection. In letters to Clementine, he spoke of his weariness, his long hours at the Admiralty, and the constant awareness that every decision carried consequences beyond his sight. Yet beneath the strain, there was always resolve. He did not regard hardship as misfortune, but as the natural companion of duty. The war, he believed, would test not only nations, but the character of individuals. "We must endure," he wrote, "for endurance is the measure of civilization." As 1915 approached, the tension between success and failure grew sharper. The empire was vast, the commitments enormous, and the weight of expectation relentless. Churchill, once the young adventurer and reformer, had become the man upon whom the security of a nation's fleet depended. His confidence remained steady, his intellect unclouded. But the events that lay ahead would soon show how fragile even the strongest vision could be in the face of war's uncertainty. History was preparing to teach him its harshest lesson: that foresight alone cannot guard against fate, and that even the boldest minds must sometimes bow before the limits of human judgment. In the spring of 1915, Winston Churchill faced the moment that would define his public reputation for years to come: the Dardanelles campaign. What began as a strategic concept, born of reason and necessity, would become one of the most debated and tragic episodes of the First World War. To Churchill, the idea was both practical and visionary. The Western Front had become a line of stalemate and suffering. Millions were locked in endless attrition. He believed that a bold stroke in the east, an attack through the Dardanelles to capture Constantinople, could open a new front, relieve pressure on the Russians, and perhaps bring the Ottoman Empire to collapse. It was not recklessness that guided him, but imagination. He saw movement where others saw paralysis, and opportunity where others saw only risk. The plan was daring. The Royal Navy, in coordination with French forces, would force the narrow straits separating Europe from Asia. If successful, the path to the Ottoman capital would lie open. allowing Britain to link with its eastern allies and potentially shorten the war. Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, became its most passionate advocate. Yet his enthusiasm outpaced the caution of his peers. Many within the Admiralty and Cabinet hesitated, uncertain of the risks and the adequacy of intelligence. Churchill pressed forward, believing that initiative was itself a weapon. He wrote with conviction that inaction under the weight of fear was the true danger of leadership. His belief in decisive action, once a source of strength, now placed him at the edge of political peril. The initial naval bombardment in February 1915 began with confidence. British and French ships attacked the Turkish forts guarding the straits, and early reports suggested progress. But beneath the surface of optimism lay critical misjudgments. The enemy's defences were more resilient than anticipated, and the narrow waters, filled with mines, turned the sea into a trap. When the great battleships Bouvet, Irresistible, and Ocean struck mines and sank within hours, hundreds of sailors perished. The sight of those proud vessels disappearing beneath the waves shocked the nation and shattered the illusion of quick victory. Churchill, though not on the scene, felt the blow as if it had struck him personally. He realised that courage alone could not compensate for flawed preparation. The campaign then shifted to a land invasion on the Gallipoli Peninsula in April. The beaches at Cape Helles and Anzac Cove became names of sacrifice. British, Australian and New Zealand troops faced fierce resistance, rugged terrain and unrelenting heat. The cliffs above the beaches turned into fortresses of death. Days became weeks, and weeks became months, with little gain. Reports reached London of mounting casualties and inadequate supplies. The promise of a swift campaign dissolved into a struggle of endurance and despair. Churchill, watching from afar, urged reinforcements and adjustments, but the situation was slipping beyond rescue. The scale of misjudgment became undeniable. What had begun as an act of strategic innovation ended as a symbol of misfortune. The political consequences were immediate. As losses grew, so did criticism. Within the government, voices rose against him, accusing him of overconfidence, of having pushed a flawed plan beyond reason. The press, once his ally, turned doubtful. His colleagues, seeking stability in chaos, found in Churchill a convenient scapegoat. Though the failure was collective, shared among planners, commanders and ministers, the weight of responsibility settled upon him alone. In May 1915, amid a reshuffling of the government, he was forced to resign from the Admiralty. It was a dismissal conducted without ceremony, and for Churchill it carried the sting of injustice. For a man who had built his life on courage and conviction, the fall from power was devastating. The burden of failure pressed upon him with relentless force. Yet even in the shadow of humiliation, he did not retreat into bitterness. He accepted his dismissal with dignity, though not without pain. In his letters to Clementine, he expressed both sorrow and resolve. "I am finished," he wrote at first, "but I am not broken." That distinction mattered. To be finished was a matter of circumstance. To be broken was a matter of will. He refused to let despair consume him. Instead, he sought redemption in the only way he knew, through action. In the autumn of that same year, Churchill volunteered for active service in France. It was a remarkable decision for a man of his stature. A former cabinet minister returning to the trenches as a common officer. To some, it appeared an act of penance, to others a reaffirmation of honour. For Churchill, it was neither symbolic nor sentimental. It was necessary. He believed that a man who sent others into danger must not shrink from it himself. If he was to understand the war's reality, he must live it. His choice reflected a deep moral instinct that would later define his leadership. That authority without sacrifice was hollow. The Gallipoli disaster left a permanent mark on his character. It taught him humility in a way that no previous failure had. He learned that vision, however noble, must be balanced by caution, and that leadership required not only imagination, but the patience to see its limits. Yet the lesson did not diminish his confidence, it refined it. He emerged from the experience more measured, more introspective, but no less determined. To his critics, Gallipoli was a stain that would follow him for decades. To Churchill himself, it was the crucible through which endurance was tempered into wisdom. In the quiet months that followed his resignation, he turned again to painting, to writing, and to thought. These pursuits, simple yet absorbing, offered solace. He reflected upon the fragility of reputation and the constancy of purpose. History, he knew, was never written by those who avoided risk. Failure, though bitter, was not defeat unless accepted as final. As he would later write, every day you may make progress, every step may be fruitful, yet there will stretch out before you an ever-lengthening path. Press on. Those words, born of disappointment, became the compass by which he would navigate the future. The story of Gallipoli did not end with the campaign's withdrawal in early 1916. Its shadow extended across Churchill's life, shaping both his public image and his private reflections. He would never deny his share of responsibility, nor would he allow it to define him entirely. The tragedy of the Dardanelles was, for him, a lesson in the limits of human foresight, a reminder that even the most brilliant plans must yield to the unpredictable will of events. When later asked how he endured such loss of honour, he replied simply, "I kept on." In that persistence lay the essence of his strength, the same resolve that had carried him across battlefields and political divides now guided him through personal defeat. The world around him still burned with conflict, and though his role had diminished, his spirit had not. The soldier of empire, the reformer of government, the architect of the navy, all these identities now gave way to a humbler figure, one who sought meaning not in power, but in endurance. The stage of history had not yet finished with him. It had merely paused. In the silence that followed Gallipoli, the foundations were being laid for the voice that would one day call a nation to its greatest trial. When Churchill left the Admiralty and made his way to France in late 1915, it was as though he were returning to the beginning of his own journey. The young cavalry officer who had once sought glory now came as a man seeking redemption. He joined the British Army on the Western Front, commanding a battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. The contrast between his past position and his present circumstance was striking. Only months earlier, he had directed fleets and shaped grand strategies. Now he lived among mud and wire, beside soldiers who measured time not in policies or speeches, but in hours survived. Yet Churchill accepted this reversal with calm dignity. To him, it was not a fall from grace, but a return to reality. The trenches were the living heart of the war, and he wanted to share its pulse. He arrived in Ploegsteert, near the Belgian border, during one of the coldest winters of the war. The landscape was a scarred expanse of shell holes, flooded trenches, and shattered trees. The air smelled of damp earth and smoke. The men, exhausted but disciplined, regarded their new commander with curiosity. Many knew his name from newspapers and political debates, but few could reconcile the image of the famous statesman with the figure who now stood among them, wearing a soldier's coat, carrying his own gear, and sharing their rations. Churchill quickly dispelled any notion of separation. He walked the lines daily, speaking to his men, learning their habits, understanding their hardships. He shared their dangers, often standing exposed to sniper fire as he observed enemy movements. His courage, quiet and steady, won their respect. The daily rhythm of the front imposed humility upon all who endured it. Orders and reports were replaced by mud, fatigue, and the constant threat of sudden death. Churchill found in this environment both hardship and clarity. The simplicity of survival stripped away the complexities of politics. Life in the trenches reduced existence to its essentials. comradeship, endurance, and faith in the dawn of another day. He kept a small notebook in which he recorded his thoughts, not as speeches or arguments, but as reflections on human endurance. Courage, he wrote, is the first of human qualities because it is the quality that guarantees all others. Even amid the horror, Churchill's mind remained active. He observed the mechanics of warfare, the movement of troops, the coordination of artillery, the psychology of men under fire. He saw that the industrial nature of modern war had transformed the battlefield into a system of attrition, where victory was measured not by manoeuvre, but by survival. The experience deepened his understanding of strategy and human cost. Later, when he would again hold the power to send men into battle, the memory of these frozen fields would remain with him, guiding his judgment with both caution and empathy. During quieter hours, he turned once more to writing and painting. With canvas and brush, he captured fragments of the world that war had not yet consumed. A sky clearing after rain, the stillness of dawn over desolate ground, the light upon ruined walls. For him, art was not escape, but restoration. It allowed the mind to hold order against chaos. These small acts of creation, performed amid destruction, reminded him that beauty and endurance could coexist even in the darkest times. His letters, home to Clementine, carried the same tone of quiet reflection. He wrote not of despair, but of renewal, of how struggle, properly understood, refined rather than destroyed the spirit. Churchill's time at the front lasted several months. It was long enough to teach him patience, long enough to silence the noise of regret. He commanded his men with fairness, insisting on discipline, but tempering it with kindness. He took particular care for their welfare, ensuring that they received warmth, food, and rest whenever possible. The men respected him because he lived as they did, without privilege or pretense. He did not seek to be loved, he sought only to be trusted. In their eyes, he was not the politician in exile, but a fellow soldier who understood the weight they carried. By the spring of 1916, the war had entered a new and even more brutal phase. The Battle of Verdun raged, and the Somme was in preparation. Churchill, though committed to his unit, began to feel that his presence in the trenches could not alter the course of events as much as his voice in Parliament might. The time had come to return to public service. He sought permission to leave his command and resume political work, not out of ambition, but out of duty. He felt that his country, facing such peril, required every capable hand. Yet his departure from the front was marked by quiet regret. He had found among the soldiers a sense of honesty that he rarely encountered in politics. "Here," he wrote, "there is no pretense. Men die for duty, not for argument." Returning to London, Churchill was greeted with a mixture of suspicion and sympathy. Many still held him responsible for the failure at Gallipoli, while others admired his humility in having faced the war firsthand. He accepted both reactions with composure. His reputation, though damaged, had gained a new dimension, that of a man who had not hidden behind authority, but had walked through the same mud as those he led. Slowly, through persistence and reason, he began to rebuild his standing. He wrote and spoke with renewed purpose, not to defend the past but to shape the future. In the years immediately following his return, Churchill's political career entered a period of transition. He served in various roles, sometimes minor, sometimes influential, gradually regaining the confidence of his peers. The lessons of the front remained his constant guide. He no longer spoke of war as an instrument of glory, but as a test of endurance and moral resolve. His speeches grew more measured, his tone more reflective. He warned against complacency in peace and against fanaticism in conflict. The balance between courage and caution, which he had learned amid the trenches, became the defining rhythm of his public life. As the war drew to its bitter end in 1918, Churchill's place in the government was once again secure, though never without controversy. He had regained influence, but more importantly, he had regained perspective. The young adventurer who had once sought fame through risk had become a statesman who understood that true greatness lay in perseverance. The years of battle, failure, and quiet service had stripped away illusion and left behind endurance. The kind of endurance that would one day sustain not only a man, but a nation. When the guns finally fell silent and the world began to count the cost, Churchill, now older and tempered, looked upon the ruins of Europe with a sense of solemn duty. He did not speak of victory with triumph, but with gravity. He knew that wars never truly end with the signing of treaties. Their echoes linger in the minds of those who survive them. For Churchill, the trenches had been both punishment and preparation. He emerged from them chastened but unbroken, carrying with him the unspoken knowledge that would guide him through the next storm. History was already preparing. When the armistice came in November 1918, the guns fell silent, but the echoes of war continued to shape every thought, every policy, and every conversation across Europe. Winston Churchill, like many of his generation, returned to a world transformed and uncertain. The victory had been immense, but so too was the loss. The empire he had served stood intact, yet its confidence was fractured. In the silence after battle, questions replaced triumph. What had the sacrifice achieved? What kind of peace could justify such suffering? Churchill, though relieved at the end of conflict, sensed that the struggle for stability was far from over. For him, peace was not the restoration of comfort, but the beginning of another test, one that would demand patience, foresight, and endurance of a different kind. He resumed political life almost immediately, serving under Prime Minister David Lloyd George in various posts, including Minister of Munitions and later Secretary of State for War. His responsibilities were immense: demobilization of millions of soldiers, reconstruction of economies, and the uneasy management of empire. The task required not merely administration, but vision, for the world was reshaping itself in ways that few could yet comprehend. The old empires, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, had collapsed, leaving a vacuum of uncertainty across Europe and the Middle East. National borders were redrawn, sometimes with reason, sometimes with haste. In this shifting landscape, Churchill's energy was both an asset and a liability. He sought order amid chaos, yet the pace of change often defied control. In 1921, as colonial secretary, he played a significant role in the negotiations that led to the creation of the Irish Free State. The years of conflict in Ireland had left scars on both nations, and the settlement, though imperfect, represented a step toward peace. Churchill, though deeply conscious of the difficulties, approached the issue with pragmatism rather than ideology. He believed that compromise, when guided by principle, was not weakness, but wisdom. The agreement cost him political support among hardline Unionists, but he accepted that cost as the price of progress. In politics, he would later say, you must sometimes walk with destiny, even when the road is uneven. Despite his continued presence in government, the post-war years proved increasingly turbulent. Britain faced economic strain, unemployment, and social unrest. The optimism of victory had given way to fatigue. Churchill, who had always believed in the moral and practical necessity of hard work, now found himself defending policies of restraint and austerity that were deeply unpopular. In 1924, after a series of political shifts and the fall of the Liberal coalition, he returned to the Conservative Party, the same party he had once left in protest. To some, it seemed a contradiction. To him, it was a recognition that the political centre of gravity had moved. What mattered was not allegiance, but principle. And he believed that the Conservative Party could best preserve national stability in a time of uncertainty. His appointment as Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1924 placed him once again at the heart of government. It was a position of immense responsibility, demanding precision, caution, and judgment. Churchill approached it with his usual thoroughness, studying economic policy as he once had studied naval warfare. He sought to restore Britain's financial credibility, to maintain the strength of the pound, and to rebuild international confidence. In 1925, he made the fateful decision to return Britain to the gold standard, believing it would restore stability. The move, however, proved ill-timed. The economy faltered, exports declined, and unemployment rose. Critics accused him of clinging to outdated orthodoxy. For Churchill, the episode was another harsh lesson in the limits of human foresight. His intentions were sound, but the outcome, as so often in his life, was marked by unforeseen consequence. Through the late 1920s and into the early 1930s, Churchill's political influence waned. The world was changing again, and his voice, still eloquent, still resolute, began to sound like an echo from an earlier age. He opposed the growing tide of socialism at home and warned against the dangers of appeasement abroad, yet his words found few listeners. The British public, weary of conflict and economic hardship, sought comfort in peace and compromise. Churchill's insistence on vigilance seemed to many an unnecessary provocation. He was gradually excluded from government, his speeches reduced to the margins of debate. This period, which he would later call his wilderness years, became one of isolation, but also of reflection. Removed from office, he turned once again to writing. His literary work during these years, including The World Crisis, his multi-volume history of the First World War, revealed a mind still deeply engaged with the lessons of the past. His prose, measured and deliberate, sought to make sense of events that had reshaped the world. He wrote not to justify himself, but to understand. Each page carried the weight of experience and the calm of analysis. The work restored his reputation as one of the finest historical writers of his age, even as his political fortunes declined. For Churchill, writing was never mere commentary. It was the continuation of thought through another form. In his home at Chartwell, surrounded by books, papers, and the quiet fields of Kent, Churchill lived a life both peaceful and restless. He painted, wrote, and reflected, yet his mind remained alert to the tremors of the outside world. He saw the rise of dictatorships in Europe with a clarity that few shared. The rhetoric of nationalism, the manipulation of public fear, the suppression of dissent, all these he recognized as warnings. He had read deeply of history, and he understood that tyranny often advanced not through sudden conquest, but through the slow erosion of freedom. As Adolf Hitler consolidated power in Germany, Churchill began to speak again, warning Parliament and the public of the danger. His warnings, however, fell upon polite indifference. The 1930s were a decade of shadows. The world, weary from one war, refused to believe that another could come. Disarmament conferences were held, treaties signed, and reassurances repeated. Churchill watched with growing frustration as Britain reduced its military strength and as Germany rearmed in defiance of international agreements. He spoke of air power, of the danger from above, and of the need for preparedness. His tone was calm, his arguments factual, but the country preferred hope to realism. Newspapers dismissed him as a relic of empire, a man unable to accept the new order of peace. His isolation deepened, yet his conviction never wavered. In the quiet of Chartwell, Churchill worked late into the night, studying intelligence reports and foreign newspapers, keeping his own records of events. He maintained contacts within the military and civil service, quietly gathering information that others ignored. It was not obsession, but duty that drove him. The belief that vigilance was the price of survival. When he looked upon Europe, he saw the same storm gathering that had once consumed his youth. He understood, perhaps more clearly than any other, that history was not finished with its lessons. As the decade drew to a close, the signs of coming conflict became undeniable. Germany had reoccupied the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and now threatened Czechoslovakia. Each act of aggression was met with hesitation, each treaty with compromise. Churchill spoke in Parliament with rising urgency, his words deliberate and grave. The malice of the wicked, he warned, was aided by the weakness of the virtuous. But his speeches, though admired for their eloquence, changed little. The nation, fearful and divided, clung to illusion. And so, as Europe drifted once more toward disaster, Churchill stood alone, a solitary figure, warning against the complacency of peace. Yet within that solitude there was no despair. He had learned from Gallipoli, from the trenches, from the long disappointments of politics, that isolation could be a form of strength. To see clearly, one must sometimes stand apart. And so he waited, patient and unyielding, as history moved toward the hour that would once again call him from silence to voice. The year 1939 arrived beneath a sky that seemed heavy with memory. The fragile peace that had followed the First World War was crumbling. Each diplomatic meeting, each conference, each hesitant declaration revealed the same truth. Europe was again descending into conflict. Winston Churchill, now in his mid-60s, had spent nearly a decade warning that such a moment would come. His voice, once dismissed as that of a restless veteran, began to sound prophetic. The very tone that had alienated him now drew reluctant attention. For years he had spoken of the danger posed by Adolf Hitler's Germany, of the futility of trusting in treaties that were violated as soon as they were signed. Now, as German armies moved into Poland, his warnings could no longer be ignored. The storm he had foreseen was upon them, and Britain would once again be forced to decide not only how to fight, but what it truly believed in. When war was declared on the 3rd of September 1939, Churchill was called back into government as First Lord of the Admiralty, the same position he had held at the outbreak of the previous war, almost 25 years earlier. The coincidence was striking, and he was keenly aware of it. The Admiralty signalled to the fleet with the simple message, "Winston is back." Those words, brief and unadorned, carried with them a sense of both confidence and foreboding. Churchill returned to his desk, older, tempered by failure, yet still driven by the same restless determination. The years in political exile had refined his understanding of responsibility. He knew now that leadership demanded not merely decision, but endurance, the willingness to face unpopularity, uncertainty, and the unbearable weight of consequence. The opening months of the war, known later as the Phony War, brought little immediate action on the Western Front. Britain and France prepared for conflict, but direct engagement remained limited. To the public, it felt like waiting for a storm that would not break. Churchill, however, refused to see in this pause any safety. He understood that the apparent calm was deception. Beneath it, Germany was gathering its strength with the precision of a machine. He worked tirelessly to strengthen Britain's defences, to mobilise its navy, and to prepare for what he knew must come. He spoke to admirals and engineers with the same intensity as he had done in 1914, but now his manner was more restrained, more deliberate. The impulsive confidence of youth had given way to the gravity of experience. As the war expanded in 1940, Germany turned westward. The fall of Norway and Denmark came swiftly, followed by the invasion of Belgium and the Netherlands. The rapid collapse of France, long considered the cornerstone of European defence, shocked the world. The Wehrmacht's advance, precise and unrelenting, demonstrated the power of modern mechanised warfare. The British Expeditionary Force, sent to aid its allies, found itself cornered at Dunkirk. The situation was desperate. Churchill, newly appointed Prime Minister following Neville Chamberlain's resignation, faced his first test not in victory, but in the possibility of national disaster. When King George VI summoned him to form a government in May 1940, Churchill accepted the charge without hesitation. He understood the magnitude of the task. Britain stood alone against a power that had already subdued much of Europe. Its army was retreating, its allies defeated, its morale uncertain. The burden of leadership in that hour was immense, yet Churchill did not see despair as an option. To him, leadership meant transmitting faith even in the darkest moment, not blind optimism, but the calm assertion that the struggle was worth enduring. His first speech to Parliament as Prime Minister set the tone for the years to come. He offered no comfort, no false hope. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears and sweat," he declared. The simplicity of the words gave them their power. The nation, hearing them, understood that the truth itself could be a form of strength. In the weeks that followed, Churchill's energy seemed boundless. He worked long hours, often deep into the night, reading reports, dictating letters, and meeting with commanders. His staff struggled to match his pace. He combined strategic insight with a human understanding of courage and fear. He knew that wars were not fought only on battlefields, but in the hearts of those who endured them. When the evacuation from Dunkirk began, it seemed impossible that so many could be saved. Yet under his direction, and through the bravery of countless sailors and civilians, more than 300,000 men were rescued. It was not victory, but survival. And in survival, Churchill found moral triumph. He told the House of Commons, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender." His words, carried by radio into every home, transformed fear into resolve. Churchill's leadership during these critical months was marked by both intensity and patience. He balanced the immediate necessity of defence with the long view of endurance. He met regularly with military chiefs, demanding clarity and honesty. He distrusted easy assurances and pressed for detail. His questions were sharp, his decisions deliberate. Yet behind the formidable exterior lay a deep sense of empathy. He visited bombed neighbourhoods, spoke with citizens in shelters, and shared their grief. His presence among the people became as powerful as his speeches. He did not hide behind authority. He stood among those who bore the cost of his decisions. In doing so, he transformed leadership from abstraction into presence. The fall of France in June 1940 brought a new phase of peril. Britain now stood alone. The continent was in German hands, and invasion seemed inevitable. The Luftwaffe prepared its assault, and the British Isles became the next target. Churchill knew that if Britain were to fall, the light of freedom in Europe might be extinguished. Yet he refused to accept that possibility. His confidence was not born of arrogance, but of necessity. He understood that despair spreads faster than fire, and that hope, if voiced with conviction, could withstand even the heaviest blows. The challenge before him was not merely to direct armies, but to sustain faith, to convince his country that endurance itself was victory. As he looked out from the windows of the war rooms beneath Whitehall, Churchill often reflected on the long path that had led him there. The failures of Gallipoli, the loneliness of the interwar years, the quiet resolve learned in the trenches, all had been preparation for this moment. Every hardship had become instruction, every disappointment a lesson in perseverance. The burden he now carried was not unfamiliar. It was the culmination of all he had endured. "This is the reason I am here," he confided to an aide. "Everything I have done has been a preparation for this hour." The summer of 1940 would test that conviction as no other period in his life had done. The enemy was gathering strength across the Channel, and the skies over Britain were soon to become the next battlefield. The courage of soldiers and sailors would be matched by the courage of civilians, who would face the coming storm not from trenches, but from their homes. Churchill, standing at the head of government, knew that the fate of his country, and perhaps of civilization itself, now rested upon the endurance of ordinary men and women. As the first bombs began to fall, he understood that the war for survival had truly begun, and that his voice would have to become the shield of a nation. By the summer of 1940, the map of Europe had been redrawn in the image of conquest. France had fallen, the Low Countries were occupied, and Britain now stood alone, separated from the Nazi Empire only by the narrow waters of the English Channel. To the east lay the silent uncertainty of Stalin's Soviet Union, bound for the moment by a fragile pact with Germany. To the west, across the Atlantic, the United States remained hesitant, still guarded by isolationism. In that solitude, Winston Churchill assumed not only the office of Prime Minister, but the weight of history itself. It was a burden that no man could fully prepare for, and yet one that he had long sensed would come. The years of warning, of exile, of study, and of personal trial had been his apprenticeship for this hour. Now the storm he had foreseen was breaking, and he stood at its very heart. The first weeks of his premiership were marked by urgency. Every morning brought news of new advances by the enemy, fresh cities under German control, new lines drawn across the map. The British Expeditionary Force had escaped from Dunkirk, but much of its equipment lay abandoned on French beaches. The nation's defences were stretched, its resources strained, and its morale uncertain. Yet beneath the exhaustion there was still pride, a quiet, stubborn pride that Churchill sought to kindle into resolve. He believed that courage was contagious, that it could spread from the leader to the people through the force of words honestly spoken. His speeches during those months became both shield and sword. They were not ornate or rhetorical for their own sake. They were measured declarations of endurance. When he told Parliament, "We shall never surrender," he did not offer a slogan. He offered a covenant that Britain's defiance would outlast the enemy's aggression. The Battle of Britain began not on distant fields, but in the air above the homeland. German bombers crossed the Channel in great formations, their engines echoing across the countryside. The Royal Air Force, vastly outnumbered, rose to meet them. The outcome of the war, and perhaps the future of Europe, would depend on these few months of struggle. Churchill followed the campaign with relentless attention. He visited airfields, spoke with pilots, and watched dogfights from observation posts. Those who saw him during this period remarked on his intensity. He would stand silently for long moments, his gaze fixed on the sky, his expression unreadable. When he turned to his companions, he would speak softly, almost as if to himself, of the courage of those young men who carried the fate of civilization on their wings. In his heart, he knew that this was the moment upon which everything depended. London became the new front line. As night fell, the sirens began, and the people sought shelter from the Luftwaffe's raids. Fires burned across the capital, lighting the sky with a dull red glow. The destruction was immense, yet the spirit of endurance held firm. Churchill walked among the ruins after each bombing, unannounced, surrounded only by a few guards. He would stop to speak with those clearing debris or comforting the injured. His presence among them was more powerful than any speech. He did not offer promises of safety, for there were none to give. Instead, he offered recognition that their suffering was not unseen, that their courage was the foundation of the nation's strength. When he returned to Downing Street, often late into the night, he carried with him the faces of those he had met. They became the measure by which he judged every decision that followed. In his war rooms beneath Whitehall, Churchill worked without rest. Maps covered the walls, pins marking troop positions and shipping routes. He read intelligence reports line by line, questioned every assumption, and demanded clarity from his advisers. His leadership style was direct and personal. He believed that authority could not be delegated entirely, that the leader must remain close to the details of execution. Yet he also possessed the rare ability to balance attention with vision. Even as he studied the movement of convoys or the allocation of aircraft, his thoughts remained fixed on the larger question: how to sustain the will of a nation under siege. Communication became his greatest weapon. The radio, a relatively new medium of mass connection, allowed him to speak directly to millions. His broadcasts to the British people during the Blitz were moments of shared endurance. The tone was measured, the delivery deliberate. He did not attempt to inspire through emotion alone. Instead, he reasoned with his listeners, appealing to their intelligence as much as to their courage. He reminded them of who they were, a free people bound by law and conscience, not by fear. He spoke of the continuity of their history, of how past generations had faced hardship and prevailed. His words gave meaning to endurance, transforming survival into a moral act. The political situation was equally demanding. Within his cabinet, there were disagreements and moments of doubt. Some argued for negotiation, for a settlement that might preserve the empire even at the cost of Europe's freedom. Churchill rejected such thinking with absolute firmness. To him, the essence of Britain's identity lay in its refusal to yield to tyranny. He understood that the war was not merely territorial, but moral, a confrontation between the idea of liberty and the rule of domination. "If this island story of ours is to end at last," he said, "let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground." The words, stark and unembellished, captured the severity of the hour and the depth of his resolve. As the months passed, the resilience of the Royal Air Force began to turn the tide. The German advance slowed, the raids continued, but failed to break the spirit of resistance. The summer gave way to autumn, and the invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, was postponed indefinitely. When victory was announced, Churchill addressed the nation with characteristic restraint. "Never in the field of human conflict," he said, "was so much owed by so many to so few." The line was not crafted for effect, but drawn from genuine reverence. It was his tribute to the pilots whose courage had defended not only Britain's shores, but the future of democracy itself. The reprieve brought by the Battle of Britain did not bring rest. The war had merely entered a new phase. The Blitz continued through the winter, targeting cities across the country. Night after night, the bombs fell, and day after day, the people rebuilt. Churchill's leadership during this time became inseparable from the endurance of the nation. He embodied the unity he preached, a figure of defiance who, by sheer presence, held the line between despair and resolve. His health, never robust, suffered from the strain. Those who worked closest to him noticed the toll, the deep lines of fatigue, the occasional tremor in his hands. Yet his will remained unshaken. "We are still masters of our fate," he told his cabinet, "and we still possess the faith to prove it." In the quiet moments between meetings, Churchill often withdrew to his study, where he would write brief notes in pencil, reflections on history, fragments of speeches, or quotations from past leaders. He saw himself not as a solitary hero, but as part of a continuum, a link in the chain of those who had defended the same principles in centuries before. The weight of history, rather than crushing him, gave him strength. It reminded him that endurance had always been the English inheritance. By the close of 1940, the immediate danger of invasion had passed, but the greater struggle was far from over. Britain stood alone still, its resources strained, its cities scarred, its people weary but unbroken. The challenge ahead was to turn endurance into strategy, to find allies, and to transform resistance into eventual victory. Churchill understood that the coming year would determine not only the fate of Britain, but the direction of the entire century. As he looked toward the uncertain horizon of 1941, he knew that survival had been secured, but salvation still lay beyond reach. The storm had gathered, and though the first assault had been withstood, the long night of war was only beginning. The year 1941 dawned upon a nation scarred yet standing, its cities darkened by blackout curtains, its people living between the rhythm of sirens and silence. Britain had survived what had seemed impossible: invasion, destruction, and isolation. Yet survival, Churchill knew, was not victory. It was endurance, and endurance demanded renewal. The struggle that had begun in the skies over southern England was not merely a military campaign. It was a moral reckoning between two visions of humanity. The Battle of Britain had ended with the Luftwaffe's withdrawal, but the war itself pressed onward, relentless and vast. Churchill, at the heart of government, felt both the relief of temporary reprieve and the deep awareness that the true measure of endurance would lie in what came next. London still smouldered from months of bombing. The ruins stood not as symbols of despair, but as silent testaments to perseverance. In the streets where homes had once stood, people carried on with the quiet dignity that had come to define the British spirit. Churchill often walked among them, his presence unannounced. He would stop to speak to shopkeepers clearing debris, to mothers carrying children to shelters, to firemen resting after nights spent among the flames. They greeted him not as a distant leader, but as one of their own, a man who shared their ordeal. For Churchill, these moments of contact were not theatrical. They were reminders of the purpose behind every decision made in the war rooms below ground. He often said that he drew strength from the people, but those who saw him knew that he gave them strength in return. The air campaign, though diminished in frequency, continued through the winter. The RAF, its ranks replenished, grew stronger and more confident. Young pilots, many barely out of training, flew missions with a courage that belied their years. Churchill visited their airfields often, watching the sleek Spitfires and Hurricanes take off against the pale morning sky. He would stand quietly, hat in hand, until the last aircraft disappeared into the clouds. When he turned away, his face showed both pride and grief. He knew how many of them would not return. Later, in Parliament, he spoke of them with measured reverence. Never was so much owed by so many to so few. The phrase, though brief, carried the full weight of gratitude and sorrow. It was not rhetoric. It was an epitaph for those still living. As Prime Minister, Churchill had to balance the immediate demands of war with the long horizon of survival. Britain's defences were strong, but its resources were finite. He knew that without allies, the nation could not endure indefinitely. Across the Atlantic, the United States remained neutral, its people wary of foreign entanglements after the memory of the last war. Yet Churchill believed that the cause of freedom was indivisible. He wrote personally to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, not as a supplicant, but as an equal in spirit. Their correspondence grew into a partnership founded upon mutual respect. Churchill's letters combined frank assessment with moral appeal. They were strategic in intent, yet human in tone. He understood that persuasion required not demand, but trust. "Give us the tools," he wrote, "and we will finish the job." It was both a request and a promise, and it carried across the ocean with quiet insistence. Through the Lend-Lease Act of early 1941, Roosevelt found a way to aid Britain without yet entering the war. Ships, planes and supplies began to flow across the Atlantic, defying the U-boat threat that stalked the convoys. For Churchill, the act represented more than material assistance. It was a lifeline of faith. It proved that moral solidarity could exist even when divided by ocean and circumstance. He spoke of it to his cabinet as the most unsordid act in the history of any nation. His gratitude was profound, yet his caution remained. He knew that the war's tide could still shift, and that the alliance, however promising, would require patience to mature into unity. Meanwhile, the daily burden of leadership continued. Each dawn brought new reports: cities bombed, ships sunk, men lost at sea. Churchill read them all personally. He refused to shield himself from the harshness of fact. "I must know everything," he told his staff. "A leader cannot govern in ignorance." The weight of information, though heavy, clarified his resolve. He knew that the test of leadership was not to appear untroubled, but to remain steadfast amid knowledge of the worst. Those who worked closest to him remarked that his confidence was not theatrical, but methodical. When others faltered, he would remind them that courage was a habit, not an impulse, something built day by day, through will and repetition. At night, when work was done and the city above lay silent except for the distant hum of aircraft, Churchill would retreat for a few hours of rest. Sleep seldom came easily. He would sit in the small dining room of the war rooms, reading dispatches or making brief notes on yellow paper. Sometimes he would turn to his secretaries and speak softly, reflecting on the wider meaning of the struggle. "This is not a war of nations alone," he once said, "but of the human spirit against the forces that would destroy it." These moments of contemplation revealed the depth of his conviction, that beyond the tactics and statistics lay something enduring and moral, something worth every sacrifice. By mid-1941, the scope of the conflict had widened. The Balkans had fallen. The Mediterranean was aflame. Yet amidst the spreading chaos, Churchill saw new alignments taking shape. When Germany turned upon its former ally and invaded the Soviet Union in June, he acted without hesitation. Despite his long-standing opposition to communism, he declared support for Russia, stating simply that any nation fighting against Nazi tyranny was Britain's ally. His pragmatism, born of necessity, was tempered by a deeper principle, that the defeat of tyranny must come before the resolution of ideology. If Hitler invaded hell, he told one of his ministers, I would at least make a favourable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. It was a grim jest, yet it captured his clarity of purpose. The year moved forward with no sign of peace. Air raids continued, the seas remained perilous, and the weight of endurance pressed heavily upon all. Yet beneath the exhaustion, there persisted a quiet, collective will, a belief that survival itself was victory. Churchill sensed this spirit and worked tirelessly to sustain it. He spoke not only to Parliament, but directly to the people, through broadcasts that combined truth with reassurance. His voice, grave yet steady, filled the darkened rooms of countless homes. It was the voice of continuity, of history itself, reminding the living that courage was not a passing flame, but a steady light. By the close of 1941, as snow fell over the bombed ruins of London, Churchill could look upon a nation battered, but not broken. Britain had endured a year of unimaginable trial and had emerged intact, its will hardened, its purpose clarified. The worst, he knew, was not yet over. But he also knew that the spirit of defiance, once kindled, could not easily be extinguished. He had seen it in the eyes of pilots, in the quiet courage of mothers searching for their children among the rubble, in the steady hands of sailors steering through blackened seas. That spirit was the true fortress of Britain, invisible, unassailable, and infinite in endurance. By the end of 1941, Winston Churchill knew that the future of Britain, and indeed the free world, depended upon forces that stretched beyond his island shores. Britain had endured the Blitz, defied invasion, and sustained itself through the darkest hours of isolation. Yet the struggle had become global. The war's geography had widened, and so too had its moral dimensions. Churchill understood that the key to ultimate victory lay across the Atlantic, in the hesitant but awakening conscience of the United States. For months he had cultivated an invisible bridge of communication with President Franklin D. Roosevelt, writing with a blend of candor and restraint. The two men, so different in background and temperament, shared an understanding that this was not a war of conquest, but of preservation, a defense of the principles upon which civilization itself rested. Their correspondence, conducted through the secure map-room cables and hand-carried letters, revealed a gradual intertwining of conviction. Churchill's messages were written in language that combined urgency with dignity. He appealed to reason, but also to destiny. He spoke of the Atlantic not as a barrier, but as a link, a common frontier between two peoples bound by law, language, and liberty. Roosevelt, though constrained by public opinion and the legacy of isolationism, responded with growing warmth. Between them developed a trust rare in diplomacy, a friendship that transcended politics. It was a relationship founded not merely upon strategy, but upon shared imagination. Both men sensed that their partnership, if fully realized, could alter the course of history. The formal bond between their nations took shape with the signing of the Atlantic Charter in August 1941. Meeting in secrecy aboard warships anchored off the coast of Newfoundland, Churchill and Roosevelt composed a document that outlined their vision for a post-war world. It was not a treaty nor a declaration of alliance, but a statement of principle. It spoke of freedom of the seas, the right of peoples to self-determination, the end of tyranny, and the pursuit of peace through justice. To Churchill, it was a reaffirmation of purpose, that the struggle Britain had endured in isolation was not for survival alone, but for the restoration of moral order. The sight of the two leaders standing together upon the decks, the wind of the Atlantic in their faces, carried a symbolism that resonated far beyond the moment. It was as though two civilizations, separated by history yet united by belief, had recognized each other anew. When Churchill returned to Britain, he carried with him more than a document. He carried the assurance that Britain was no longer alone. Though America had not yet entered the war, the tide of inevitability had begun to turn. Supplies flowed across the Atlantic under the Lend-Lease program, convoys braving the submarine-infested waters of the North Atlantic. Each ship that arrived safely was a testament to endurance. Each one sunk a reminder of the cost. Churchill followed these reports with a mixture of gratitude and anxiety. He knew that the lifeline was fragile, that the outcome of the entire war might hinge upon these invisible battles beneath the sea. He pressed his admirals to innovate, to adapt, to think as he did, not in terms of defence, but of momentum. "It is not enough to endure," he said in one of his memos. "We must move, and movement must mean the enemy's doubt." Then, in December 1941, the war's landscape changed utterly. On the 7th of that month, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor drew the United States into the conflict. The news reached Churchill late at night. He listened in silence, aware that history had turned. The next morning, he wrote in his diary, "Being saturated and satiated with emotion and sensation, I went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful." For him, the entry of America meant that the free world, once divided, was now united. The arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt called it, would bring the material and moral power that could make victory possible. Yet Churchill knew that alliance brought not relief, but new responsibility. The war had expanded to every ocean and continent, and Britain's role would shift from solitary defiance to partnership in a global endeavour. Within days, Churchill crossed the Atlantic once more, the first wartime leader to do so, to meet with Roosevelt in Washington. The voyage was perilous, the seas patrolled by U-boats, but he went without hesitation. The meeting that followed, held during Christmas of 1941, marked the true beginning of the Anglo-American alliance. Churchill stayed at the White House for nearly a month, working daily with the President and his staff. Together, they established the combined chiefs of staff and coordinated military strategy across theatres. In the evenings, they dined and talked, sometimes until dawn. The conversations ranged beyond war to philosophy, history, and faith in human endurance. Roosevelt, confined to his wheelchair yet radiant with humour, and Churchill, weary but unyielding, shared a sense that they were custodians of something larger than victory, the preservation of human dignity. On Christmas Eve, they appeared together before a vast crowd outside the White House, where a tree stood shining with light amid the darkened Capitol. Churchill spoke softly, his voice carrying through the cold air. "Here, in the midst of war, I can see the light shining clear and unquenchable." The image was simple, but it carried the weight of centuries, the symbol of light as defiance, of faith surviving destruction. For millions listening by radio across the world, the moment was one of rare stillness and hope. It was as if the partnership of the two nations had found expression not only in power, but in spirit. The months that followed were consumed by planning and coordination. The Allied strategy required patience and unity. Churchill, long accustomed to command, now had to adapt to collaboration on an unprecedented scale. He understood the necessity of subordination when the cause demanded it. The British Empire, for all its heritage, could no longer carry the burden of leadership alone. America's industrial might would soon eclipse Britain's resources, and Churchill accepted this with grace. His concern was not prestige, but purpose. "It is the result that counts," he told his colleagues. "The name upon it matters little if it brings freedom nearer." As 1942 began, Churchill returned home to a nation weary but encouraged. The enemy was still formidable, the losses still grievous, yet for the first time there was a sense of direction. He spoke to Parliament with renewed energy, emphasising not triumph, but perseverance. "This is not the end," he said. "It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning." The phrase, restrained and precise, captured the moment exactly. A turning point not of circumstance, but of spirit. The people understood. They knew that the road ahead would be long, but they also knew that they no longer walked it alone. In the quiet of his study at Chartwell, Churchill often reflected upon the strange symmetry of history. The man who had once stood alone in the wilderness, warning of the dangers that others refused to see, now stood at the centre of the world's alliance. The exile had become the axis. Yet he took little personal satisfaction in this transformation. He saw himself not as a figure of destiny, but as an instrument of necessity, one voice among many, called by history to speak when silence was no longer possible. His purpose was not glory, but service, not fame, but the endurance of civilization itself. The year 1942 opened with uncertainty, exhaustion, and the grim recognition that victory still lay far beyond the horizon. Although Britain now stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States and the Soviet Union, the global tide of war still flowed against the Allies. In the Far East, Japan advanced with terrifying speed, capturing Singapore, the pride of Britain's Eastern Empire, and striking deep into Burma and the Pacific. In North Africa, the British Eighth Army struggled against the formidable tactics of General Erwin Rommel. The U-boat campaign in the Atlantic continued to take a relentless toll on shipping, threatening once again the island nation's lifeline. Churchill, now at the apex of leadership, bore these burdens with a visible gravity. His speeches, once ablaze with defiance, grew measured, deliberate, almost austere. He understood that after endurance must come direction, and that the faith of the people, though steadfast, required purpose as well as hope. He divided his days between war councils, correspondence with Roosevelt and Stalin, and journeys across continents. The demands of leadership now transcended geography. To sustain the coalition, Churchill had to serve as soldier, statesman, and diplomat in equal measure. Each ally fought for survival, but each also carried its own ambitions and suspicions. Churchill moved among them as a mediator of purpose, speaking in the calm language of necessity. He believed that victory would not be achieved by dominance, but by unity, that the Allies must hold together not only through arms, but through trust. It was an understanding that drew upon his long experience of politics, where persuasion often counted for more than command. In the North African desert, the long stalemate turned to struggle and then slowly to resurgence. The appointment of General Bernard Montgomery brought renewed energy to the British forces. Churchill visited the front in August 1942, flying across perilous skies to inspect the men and their commanders. The heat, the dust, and the vast emptiness of the desert seemed to distill the war into its most elemental form: endurance against time, courage against despair. Churchill spoke to the troops with simplicity. He told them that their battle would mark a turning point in the fate of the empire, that in their steadfastness lay the hope of all free nations. When he returned to London, he carried with him a cautious optimism. The tide was shifting, though slowly, through the combined weight of courage and persistence. That autumn at El Alamein, the British army struck back. The battle raged for days, the roar of artillery echoing across the desert plains. When the news of victory reached London, Churchill addressed the nation with a restraint born of long memory. "Before Alamein," he said, "we never had a victory. After Alamein, we shall never have a defeat." The words were more than observation, they were prophecy. El Alamein marked not the end of the war, but the turning of its tide. From that moment, the Allies moved from survival toward momentum. The discipline, patience, and faith that had sustained Britain through years of trial were beginning to bear fruit. Yet even in victory, Churchill remained sober. He knew that success in one theatre could not disguise peril in another. The war stretched across oceans and continents, each front demanding attention, resources, and resolve. He travelled constantly to Cairo, to Moscow, to Washington, carrying with him not only plans and reports, but the intangible weight of unity. His meetings with Stalin were especially difficult. The Soviet leader, brutal and calculating, demanded a second front in Europe to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. Churchill, bound by practical limits, urged patience while promising support. Between them stretched a gulf of ideology and mistrust, yet Churchill approached the alliance with clarity, that necessity, not affection, bound them. "If Hitler invaded hell," he had once said, "I would at least make a favourable reference to the devil." Now he lived by those words. The conferences of 1942 and 1943 tested Churchill's stamina and his capacity for persuasion. In Washington, he worked side by side with Roosevelt to align strategies, debating every movement of men and material. Their friendship deepened through the long nights of planning and reflection. Roosevelt's calm vision complemented Churchill's passionate determination. Together, they formed what would become one of the most effective partnerships in modern history. When disagreements arose, and they often did, they were settled not by force, but by faith in a shared purpose. Both men understood that leadership, at its highest level, was not a matter of dominance, but of endurance, of remaining steadfast when others faltered. On his return from these journeys, Churchill was met each time by the unchanging sight of London's resilience. Though the worst of the Blitz was over, the city still bore its scars: the shattered churches, the blackened ruins, the silent gaps where homes had once stood. He took solace in the ordinary rhythms of the people, their quiet determination to continue life as before. To him, the endurance of civilians was the true miracle of the war. They had borne more than soldiers or statesmen, and yet they asked for little. When he walked among them, stopping to speak in the markets or the streets, their faces reflected not heroism, but constancy, a faith that their endurance was part of something larger than themselves. By late 1943, the Allies had begun to see the pattern of victory forming. The invasion of Italy brought the first breach of Hitler's fortress Europe. German forces, once invincible, were being pushed back. Yet for Churchill, triumph remained tempered by the cost. He visited hospitals where the wounded lay in long rows, and his expression, though calm, betrayed sorrow. He knew that each victory was paid for in youth and promise, and that even the most righteous cause could not escape the shadow of loss. His speeches in this period were quieter, reflective, often ending with long pauses that seemed to allow space for mourning. He had learned that the language of victory must also include reverence for sacrifice. As 1943 drew to its close, Churchill looked once more to the future. The war had entered a new stage, one of movement, coordination, and global scope. Plans were forming for the invasion of Western Europe, a task so immense that it required the full measure of faith and organisation the Allies could summon. In his heart, he knew that the final act would be the most perilous. To strike across the Channel, into the heart of Nazi-occupied France, would demand precision, secrecy, and an unbroken unity of purpose. It would also demand from him the same qualities that had carried him through the long years of isolation and war: courage, patience, and the refusal to despair. For now, he allowed himself one moment of reflection. Alone one evening, during his journey home from a conference in Cairo, he stood on the deck of his transport ship, watching the sea stretch endlessly beneath the moonlight. The air was cold and still, the world momentarily silent. He thought of those lost at sea, of the cities in ruin, of the millions still waiting for liberation. And in that quiet, he felt the faint sense of destiny, not as triumph, but as duty. He did not see himself as saviour or conqueror, but as custodian of an unbroken line of endurance that began long before him and would continue long after. The tide was turning, yes, but the storm had not yet passed. The hardest crossing still lay ahead. By the beginning of 1944, the war had reached a decisive threshold. After years of endurance and sacrifice, the Allies were preparing to reclaim the continent. The invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, the long-awaited Second Front, would test not only military precision, but the unity of will forged over years of hardship. Winston Churchill, now 70 years old, carried the full burden of anticipation. He knew that this moment, more than any other, would decide whether all that had been endured would end in victory or in renewed tragedy. The invasion of France was not merely a strategic operation, it was a moral and historical reckoning. Every decision, every delay, every life placed in jeopardy would be judged by generations to come. He approached it with the solemnity of a man who understood that destiny, once beckoned, could neither be postponed nor refused. The planning for what would become Operation Overlord began in earnest in the winter months. Churchill worked closely with Roosevelt, with General Eisenhower, and with the British Chiefs of Staff to coordinate the enormous task of assembling men, ships, and material on a scale the world had never seen. The operation demanded secrecy, precision, and above all, faith in coordination. Faith that thousands of moving parts bound by one purpose would act as a single force when the moment came. Churchill spent long hours in briefings, questioning every assumption, challenging every plan. His mind, still sharp and restless, sought to foresee every possible contingency. He could be irritable, even combative, but those who worked beside him understood that his intensity sprang from care, not pride. For him, no detail was too small when the cost was measured in lives. He also felt deeply the human dimension of what was coming. He knew that thousands of young men would soon cross the Channel, many of them never to return. The thought haunted him in quiet moments. On the eve of the invasion, he requested permission from his military advisers to join the fleet that would lead the assault. It was an impulse born not of vanity, but of solidarity. He wished to share in the fate of those he was sending into battle. The idea was firmly refused, first by his generals and then by the king himself, who reminded him that his duty was not to die with his soldiers, but to live for them. Churchill yielded reluctantly, though with visible sorrow. To him, leadership meant not detachment, but participation. It was one of the few occasions in his life when duty required him to remain still. On the morning of June 6, 1944, news reached London that the invasion had begun. The first reports were terse, coded, uncertain. For hours, Churchill moved between his office and the war room, speaking with commanders, receiving updates, and dictating messages. He smoked continually, his face drawn with tension. Those present later recalled that he seemed both intensely focused and strangely calm, as if he had entered a state of waiting that suspended time itself. As the day unfolded, the scale of the operation became clear. Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men, and the hopes of entire nations had crossed the Channel in the largest amphibious assault in history. By nightfall, the news was better than any had dared to hope. The landings at Normandy had succeeded. Despite fierce resistance, the Allies had secured a foothold on the beaches. Churchill, listening to the reports, allowed himself a moment of quiet relief. Yet he did not speak of triumph. "This is the beginning," he said simply. "Only the beginning." He knew that the hardest battles lay ahead: the hedgerows of Normandy, the advance through France, the crossing of the Rhine. But the door had been opened. The liberation of Europe was no longer a dream deferred, but a task in motion. In the weeks that followed, he visited Normandy. The sight of the beaches, strewn with wreckage and silent with the memory of struggle, left a deep impression on him. He walked among the graves of soldiers, many barely older than his own sons had once been, and stood in silence for a long time. Those who accompanied him noticed that he did not speak, did not dictate notes, did not look toward the cameras that recorded his visit. He simply bowed his head. Later that evening, he wrote in his diary, "How great a price has been paid to bring back the light of freedom to the world." That sentence, though private, reflected the essence of his belief that liberty, once lost, could be restored only through sacrifice. The liberation of Paris in August brought scenes of joy across Europe, and yet Churchill's satisfaction was tempered by reflection. He knew that the fall of one tyranny often gave rise to new tensions. Even as German forces retreated, the shadow of the Soviet Union lengthened across Eastern Europe. He foresaw that the defeat of Hitler would not bring universal peace, but a new division of power, a balance that would demand vigilance long after the guns had fallen silent. His correspondence with Roosevelt during this period reveals both pride and anxiety. He wrote of victory not as an ending, but as a transition, a moment to secure justice before complacency could again take hold. Through the autumn and winter of 1944, Churchill's leadership remained steady but weary. The long strain of war had begun to show in his health. He suffered bouts of fatigue, and his doctors warned him of the dangers of overwork. Yet he refused rest. "When the war is won," he told them, "there will be time enough for sleep." He travelled again to meet Roosevelt and Stalin at the Yalta Conference, where the future of post-war Europe was debated with uneasy pragmatism. The alliance that had carried them through war was already beginning to show cracks. Churchill, though pragmatic, resisted the idea that might alone should define peace. He spoke of moral responsibility, of the duty to rebuild not merely nations, but principles. His words, though eloquent, were often met with silence. The unity forged by necessity was already dissolving into rivalry. In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces advanced toward Berlin, Churchill reflected on the vast arc of the conflict. The war that had begun in isolation had grown into a struggle that spanned the globe, uniting millions in common cause. The cost was beyond measure: cities destroyed, families divided, generations scarred. And yet, from that suffering had arisen a new clarity, that freedom was not an inheritance, but a trust, renewed by each generation through courage and vigilance. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. That evening, Churchill addressed the nation from the same office where he had once promised only blood, toil, tears, and sweat. His voice, calm yet resonant, carried through the radios of homes and shelters across the land. He spoke of victory not with exultation, but with reverence. "This is your victory," he told the people, "because you never flinched and you never failed." The crowds outside Downing Street cheered and sang. For a few moments, the entire nation seemed to breathe as one. Yet even as he joined in the celebration, Churchill's expression remained reflective. He had guided Britain through its darkest hour, but he knew that peace would bring its own burdens. The age of war was ending. The age of reconstruction was beginning. And in that new age, the same endurance that had saved the nation would again be required, not against an enemy of arms, but against the far subtler challenges of memory, fatigue, and change. The summer of 1945 arrived with the heavy quiet that follows thunder. The war in Europe was over. The enemy's banners had fallen. For the first time in 6 long years, Britain could lift its eyes from the horizon and look inward. Streets once darkened by blackout curtains filled again with light. Families that had lived by air raid sirens and telegrams tried to recover the rhythm of peace. The nation had survived, weary, scarred, but alive. And at the centre of that survival stood Winston Churchill, the man whose voice had steadied Britain through its greatest trial. He was hailed across the world as the architect of endurance, the symbol of defiance. His image, captured in photographs and newsreels, seemed to embody the nation's triumph. Yet Churchill himself viewed victory not as culmination, but as transformation. He understood that peace would test his people more subtly than war, and that the moral strength which had endured bombardment might now falter amid comfort and exhaustion. The end of the war brought new and immediate challenges. Britain, though victorious, was a nation impoverished. Its cities lay in ruin, its industries strained, its empire weakened by distance and cost. Millions of men awaited demobilization, uncertain of their future. Families faced shortages, rationing and displacement. Churchill, who had governed as a warlord, commanding, decisive, unyielding, now faced the task of guiding a country that no longer needed a commander, but a caretaker. The habits of crisis, which had sustained him in war, were ill-suited to the quieter demands of reconstruction. Yet he approached the new reality with the same gravity that he had brought to every challenge of his life. He believed that the preservation of liberty was not complete until it was matched by social stability and opportunity for all. His post-war plans combined compassion with prudence, rebuilding homes, reforming welfare, securing Britain's global standing. But the machinery of democracy, paused during the emergency of war, had now resumed its normal rhythm, and that rhythm was governed by choice. A general election was announced for July 1945. Churchill campaigned with energy, though beneath his resolve he sensed the changing tide. The British people, grateful for his wartime leadership, now yearned for renewal. The Labour Party, under Clement Attlee, offered a vision of social reform and reconstruction. A new beginning built on equality and collective security. Churchill's campaign speeches invoked liberty and duty, warning against the perils of socialism, but the words that once roused courage now sounded rooted in another age. His greatness had been forged in crisis. Peace required another kind of voice. When the votes were counted, the result was decisive. Labour won by a landslide. The man who had guided Britain to victory found himself within weeks out of office. The news was received with astonishment across the world. Foreign correspondents struggled to explain how the nation that had been led to triumph by Churchill could now dismiss him. Yet within Britain, the decision carried a quiet logic. The people, weary of struggle, wanted change, not sentiment. Churchill accepted the outcome with dignity, offering congratulations to Attlee and reminding the country that democracy itself was the finest fruit of the freedom they had defended. "They have a perfect right," he said simply. "It is what we fought for." His composure, though admirable, could not conceal his personal sorrow. For the first time in decades, he was without office, without command. The rhythm of crisis, which had given his life its tempo, had ceased. He retreated to Chartwell, his home in Kent, to rest, to paint, and to write. At Chartwell, he rediscovered the silence he had long been denied. The gardens, the brick terraces, the view across the valley, all seemed to belong to another century, untouched by the noise of war. He spent long hours painting, his brush tracing quiet landscapes and still waters. Friends who visited found him reflective, but not despondent. "I am not sad," he told one, "only thoughtful." Yet beneath that calm there remained the restlessness of a man for whom action was as natural as breath. He followed politics closely, writing essays and giving lectures. His speeches abroad carried the same precision and clarity that had once steadied his nation. In one of these, delivered at Fulton, Missouri, in 1946, he gave the world a new phrase: the Iron Curtain. With those words, he warned of the division that was already descending upon Europe, the ideological boundary that would define the second half of the 20th century. Many found the phrase alarming, but Churchill spoke not to incite fear, only to awaken vigilance. Having seen the cost of unheeded warnings once before, he refused to let history repeat its negligence. In private, he was more introspective. He wrote his multi-volume The Second World War, not merely as history, but as meditation, a record of endurance and of the strange symmetry between fate and will. Each page bore the rhythm of recollection, the balance between pride and humility. He did not conceal his errors, nor did he exaggerate his victories. The work reflected his lifelong belief that history was not a tale of perfection, but of perseverance, that greatness lay not in avoiding failure, but in refusing to yield to it. His writing, calm and deliberate, revealed a man who, though removed from power, had not lost his sense of purpose. Yet the world he had helped to save was rapidly changing. The empire to which he had devoted his life was beginning to dissolve. Across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, movements for independence gathered strength. The age of imperial certainty, the world of his youth, was ending. Churchill, who had once seen the empire as the vessel of British destiny, now struggled to reconcile sentiment with inevitability. He spoke with grace about the need for adaptation, yet his heart remained tethered to the idea of imperial unity. It was one of the few subjects upon which his vision and time no longer aligned. Still, he faced these transformations with civility, never bitterness. He believed that the endurance of principle mattered more than the endurance of power. "We shape our buildings," he once said, "and afterwards our buildings shape us." The same was true, he knew, of nations. In the late 1940s, as Europe rebuilt itself from ruin, Churchill remained a figure of moral gravity. His voice carried the weight of memory, and his words were sought in times of doubt. Though no longer at the helm, he remained a touchstone for steadiness. When he travelled abroad, to the United States, to the emerging United Nations, to universities filled with young men and women, he spoke of unity, of the need to balance strength with mercy. His tone was quieter now, stripped of wartime urgency, yet still imbued with clarity. He had come to embody not only the courage of resistance, but the wisdom of restraint. In his heart, however, he never ceased to feel the pulse of leadership. He still believed that destiny had more work for him to do, and time, though unkind, seemed to allow it. The years of rest that followed his electoral defeat would not be permanent. The wheel of circumstance, ever turning, would soon bring him once more to the seat of power, older, slower, but tempered by reflection. The world, meanwhile, was entering an age of cold suspicion and atomic fear. Churchill's warning at Fulton would prove prophetic. The line that divided East and West was hardening into permanence, and soon the voice that had once guided a nation through fire would be called again to speak to a world struggling to find peace in the shadow of power. In the years that followed the war, Europe lay exhausted yet restless, its cities rebuilding from rubble, its nations struggling to redefine themselves amid the shifting balance of power. Winston Churchill, though out of office, remained one of the few figures whose voice still carried across continents. He had seen empires rise and fall, had witnessed the collapse of peace through complacency, and now, in the uneasy quiet of post-war reconstruction, he perceived another shadow advancing, not of invasion this time, but of ideology. He understood, before many others did, that the end of one tyranny had opened the way for another. The wartime alliance that had defeated Hitler was dissolving into mistrust, and across the continent, Soviet influence was spreading like a tide that moved not with armies, but with silence. When Churchill travelled to the United States in 1946, invited by President Truman to speak at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, he sensed that the moment required clarity, not comfort. The speech he delivered there was sober, deliberate, and prophetic. He spoke of an iron curtain descending across Europe, behind which lay the territories now under Soviet control, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and others that had once been independent in spirit, if not always in strength. He warned that behind this barrier, freedom was being extinguished quietly, systematically, beneath the language of liberation. His words were not intended to incite fear, but to awaken vigilance. He had seen once before how the blindness of democracies invited the advance of dictatorship, and he refused to let the same blindness shape the peace that had been so dearly won. The phrase "iron curtain" spread swiftly across the world, crystallizing what many had sensed, but few had dared to name. Some greeted his warning with gratitude, others with alarm. To those weary of war, the notion of new confrontation seemed unbearable. To Churchill, it was not confrontation he urged, but preparation. Peace, he believed, was not sustained by hope alone, but by clarity and strength. If the Western democracies stand together, he declared, there is no reason why they should not command peace for generations. It was a simple truth drawn from the lessons of his lifetime, that unity was the shield of freedom. Upon returning to Britain, he found himself once again both admired and criticised. Many in his own country, still recovering from war's exhaustion, felt uneasy with his insistence on vigilance. Yet Churchill did not measure his words by popularity. He believed that history judged not by applause, but by endurance. His clarity of vision during the 1930s had come too late to prevent disaster. Now he was determined that the new generation should not repeat that failure. Privately, he corresponded with leaders across Europe, encouraging cooperation and mutual defence. His efforts, though informal, laid the groundwork for what would become the Western Alliance, an understanding that peace must be actively guarded, not merely declared. In these years, Churchill's life entered a quieter rhythm. At Chartwell, he wrote and painted, yet his mind never rested. He followed the news of the world with the same attentiveness he had once given to dispatches of war. Each day, reports arrived from Eastern Europe, accounts of censorship, imprisonment, the suppression of opposition. He annotated them meticulously, filing them among his papers. To him, history was not an abstraction, but a living process, unfolding daily, demanding witness. His concern was not confined to Europe. He followed the growing independence movements within the British Empire with equal attention, recognizing that the world was moving toward a new balance between nations. Though reluctant to accept the pace of decolonization, he acknowledged its inevitability with the measured realism that experience had taught him. The future, he knew, belonged to the forces of self-determination, just as the past had belonged to empire. Despite his age, Churchill's influence remained undiminished. His speeches in Parliament, though delivered now from the opposition benches, carried the same authority that had once rallied a nation. His words bore the gravity of a man who had seen too much to speak lightly. When he rose to speak, members listened not out of courtesy, but out of recognition, that in his voice echoed not rhetoric, but memory. He urged moderation in domestic politics and firmness in foreign affairs. He saw that Britain, though diminished in empire, could still stand at the moral centre of the world, a bridge between the United States and Europe, between tradition and change. His vision of a United States of Europe, proposed in 1946, revealed his belief that only cooperation could preserve civilization in an age of power blocks and atomic weapons. Yet even as he looked outward, Churchill's inner reflections deepened. He was entering his 70s, and though his physical strength began to wane, his mental vigour remained formidable. His writings during this period reveal a man increasingly conscious of time, not only his own, but history's. In his study late at night, he would often sit before a map of Europe, tracing the borders that had shifted through his lifetime. The lines, drawn and redrawn by war and diplomacy, reminded him of the fragility of all human arrangements. "Empires of the mind," he once wrote, "are the only ones which can last." It was both confession and creed. In public, he maintained the dignity of statesmanship. In private, he was reflective, even melancholic. The memory of the war never left him. He often spoke of the fallen with a quiet reverence that belied his formidable exterior. To those who worked with him, it seemed that the ghosts of those years still walked beside him. The soldiers of Dunkirk, the pilots of the Battle of Britain, the civilians who had endured the Blitz. They were the measure by which he judged every new challenge. He knew that courage was not infinite, that peace, if mishandled, could drain it faster than war. By 1951, when the electorate returned him to office as Prime Minister once again, Churchill was 76 years old. The man who had once guided Britain through fire now returned to lead it through uncertainty. The new world he inherited was not one of ruins, but of rivalries, a world divided by ideology, armed with weapons capable of unimaginable destruction. He approached his second premiership with humility, aware that time was against him. Yet he carried into it the same sense of mission that had animated his entire life, the defence of civilization against the forces that would erode it. His task was no longer to command armies, but to preserve peace. A peace fragile, uneasy, and perpetually at risk of dissolving into fear. In this new role, Churchill often spoke of the moral responsibility of power. He sought dialogue where others sought dominance, patience where others sought haste. His speeches, quieter now, were no less profound. He warned that the atomic age demanded not triumph, but wisdom, that humanity's power to destroy must be matched by its capacity to restrain. The world listened, if not always with agreement, then with respect. For even in age, his voice carried the authority of experience, the steady reminder that progress without conscience was merely another form of peril. And so, as the Iron Curtain descended and the world divided into camps of suspicion and strength, Churchill once again stood between them, not as warrior this time, but as witness. He had lived long enough to see his own warnings take shape, and yet he refused despair. His faith in endurance, tested by war and renewed in peace, remained his guiding light. "The problems of victory are more agreeable than those of defeat," he once observed, "but they are no less difficult." In that acknowledgement lay the essence of his wisdom, that history's trials do not end, they merely change form. And as he looked upon the new generation, inheriting both the triumphs and the fears of his own, he could only hope that they too would have the courage to see clearly, to act boldly, and to endure. When Winston Churchill returned to power in October 1951, the world he now faced was not the one he had known in war. The roar of artillery had been replaced by the quiet hum of reconstruction. Yet beneath that calm lay unease, the uneasy equilibrium of the Cold War. The victors of 1945 were now adversaries in ideology, and the same alliances that had secured survival had hardened into suspicion. Britain, once the heart of empire, was now a nation in transition, adjusting to diminished power and shifting purpose. For Churchill, this return to office was not a triumph, but a duty. He accepted it with the quiet resignation of a man aware that history had called upon him one final time. He was 76, an age when most would have sought rest, but rest was a word foreign to his nature. He still believed that leadership, even in decline, carried the obligation to guide, to reconcile, to warn, to preserve. The tasks before him were immense. The country he had led through war was weary, its economy fragile, its empire strained by the stirrings of independence. India was already free. The Middle East and Africa were beginning to demand the same. The world's balance of power had shifted decisively toward the United States and the Soviet Union, and Britain's place was no longer as master of empire, but as guardian of stability. Churchill approached this transformation with both pride and realism. He knew that greatness could no longer be measured by territorial reach, but by moral influence. "We are not at the top of the tree," he once remarked privately, "but we can still give shelter." To him, Britain's purpose lay not in domination, but in example, in showing that democracy could endure even as empires faded. His government, though formed in an age of peace, carried the echoes of war's discipline. Cabinet meetings were formal, precise, and guided by his insistence on preparation. Yet Churchill's leadership had softened with time. The fiery urgency that once characterized his wartime command had given way to contemplation. His ministers found him reflective, at times withdrawn, as though he viewed events not from within them, but from the long perspective of history. His speeches in Parliament were fewer, his voice quieter, but each word bore the weight of finality. He spoke less to persuade than to remind, to anchor a restless world in the memory of what had been endured. Foreign policy remained his deepest preoccupation. The division of Europe tormented him. The Iron Curtain, which he had named, now stood immovable, fortified by nuclear arsenals and mutual suspicion. Churchill's hope in these years was not to win another war, but to prevent one. He pursued reconciliation where possible, especially with the Soviet Union. His proposal for a summit between the great powers, Britain, the United States, and the USSR, was met with skepticism by some of his colleagues who saw it as naive. But Churchill's motives were not naive. They were rooted in the long memory of conflict. He believed that dialogue, however fragile, was the only antidote to fear. Having once seen how misunderstanding could ignite catastrophe, he was determined to use his remaining influence to preserve peace through communication. "Meeting jaw to jaw," he said, "is better than war to war." In these later years, he also turned increasingly toward Europe. His call for a United States of Europe, made several years earlier, had been visionary, but now he worked quietly to support it. He saw in the European movement not a threat to Britain's sovereignty, but a safeguard against its isolation. He believed that the future would belong not to empires or blocs, but to communities bound by shared purpose. It was an idea far ahead of its time, but consistent with the deeper rhythm of his thought, that endurance depended not on walls, but on understanding. At home, Churchill faced the steady encroachment of age. His health, long strained by work and habit, began to fail. He suffered from fatigue, bouts of melancholy, and the lingering effects of a stroke in 1953, which was kept largely secret from the public. Yet even illness could not extinguish his will. When confined to bed, he continued to dictate memoranda and letters, his voice rasping but resolute. He saw every day of recovery as an extension of duty. Those around him sometimes urged retirement, but Churchill resisted. "I cannot rest," he told his physician. "I have unfinished work." The remark carried no vanity. It was the simple recognition of a man whose identity had long been inseparable from responsibility. In that same year, he received the Nobel Prize for Literature, an honour that surprised many but satisfied him deeply. The citation praised his mastery of historical writing and oratory, his ability to give form to the moral and intellectual struggles of the age. For Churchill, the award was less a personal triumph than a vindication of language itself. He had always believed that words could be weapons, that truth could be defended through clarity and rhythm. His acceptance reflected that conviction. In all things, he said, we are spirits, not beasts. It was perhaps his last great public statement, a reaffirmation of the human capacity for reason amid the machinery of power. Even as he withdrew gradually from daily government, his mind remained fixed upon the great questions of his time. He followed developments in the nuclear arms race with particular concern. The atomic bomb, whose existence had ended one war, now threatened to make all wars final. Churchill spoke of the need for restraint, for balance between power and conscience. He viewed the atomic age not as triumph, but as warning, proof that humanity's capacity for invention must be tempered by wisdom. In this, as in so much else, he saw the same moral pattern repeated, that progress without humility led only to peril. By 1955, his health could no longer sustain the burdens of leadership. After long hesitation, he resigned as Prime Minister, leaving office with the same quiet dignity with which he had returned to it. His farewell to the House of Commons was simple and without flourish. He spoke briefly of gratitude, of endurance, and of faith in the generations that would follow. The day may dawn, he said, when fair play, love for one's fellow men, respect for justice and freedom will enable tormented generations to march forth serene and triumphant from the hideous epoch in which we have to dwell. His colleagues, many of them younger men who had grown up under his shadow, stood in silence as he departed. It was the end of an era, but not of his influence. Retirement did not bring idleness. Churchill returned to Chartwell, to the rhythms of writing, painting, and reflection. The house, filled with the artifacts of his long life, maps, letters, books, uniforms, and medals, became a quiet museum of memory. He received visitors from across the world, statesmen, soldiers, and scholars who came to pay tribute to the man who had once embodied the courage of civilization. They found him courteous, sometimes irritable, often humorous, and always aware. He spoke freely, though with less urgency, about the past and its lessons. To one visitor, he said, "I was not the lion, but it fell to me to give the lion's roar." It was perhaps his most modest summary of his life's work, a recognition that leadership, at its greatest, was an act of voice, the articulation of collective courage. The years after his resignation were marked by both serenity and decline. He grew frail, his movements slower, his silences longer. Yet even in quietude, his presence seemed undiminished. He would sit for hours by the window overlooking the fields of Kent, watching the changing light, the gentle continuity of nature. It was a contrast to the tumult of his earlier life, but not a contradiction. For Churchill, the essence of endurance, whether in war, in politics, or in age, lay in acceptance, the understanding that strength could reside as much in stillness as in struggle. The final decade of Winston Churchill's life unfolded like the slow turning of a long and noble symphony, its early themes returning in quiet variations, its energy diminished, but its tone unchanged. The noise of politics receded, replaced by the stillness of remembrance. At Chartwell, his refuge among the rolling hills of Kent, he found himself surrounded by the tangible symbols of his life: the books, the maps, the paintings, and the echoes of the words that had once moved millions. The house was both sanctuary and museum, a living archive of experience. Here he spent his days between writing and reflection, surrounded by those few who had shared his journey, and by the memories of those who had not lived to see peace. The world continued to turn, but for Churchill time seemed to slow, allowing him at last to look back across the vast expanse of his years. He devoted much of his energy to writing, driven not by vanity but by duty to record what he had witnessed. His history of the Second World War grew into 6 volumes, a monument of analysis, recollection, and insight. Each page bore the weight of both intellect and conscience. He wrote of events with the precision of a statesman, but also with the humility of a witness. His tone was calm, almost detached, yet beneath the restraint lay deep feeling, not for his own achievements, but for the endurance of those who had carried the burdens of history with him. He gave every soldier, sailor, and citizen their due, as though by naming them he could grant permanence to their sacrifice. The work was widely read, admired, and translated into many languages. It restored him not to office, but to the realm of ideas, a realm he had always regarded as the truest domain of power. Painting became his second form of writing, a language without words. In front of the canvas, he found release from the weight of memory. The brush allowed what speeches could not, an escape from argument, from decision, from the ceaseless movement of thought. He painted landscapes, skies, and quiet water, images of tranquility that seemed to defy the chaos he had spent a lifetime confronting. Visitors who came to see him in these years often found him before his easel, absorbed in colour and light, his hand steady even as his step had slowed. "When I paint," he once said, "I forget everything else." The act was both discipline and solace, a way to reconcile the restless mind with the stillness of age. He continued to receive guests, old comrades, political figures, friends, and family. The conversations were often long and reflective. He would speak of history as though it were an unfinished book, and of the future as though he could still shape its chapters. His humour, though softened by time, never left him. At dinner he was convivial, and though his voice had grown weaker, his laughter remained robust. Yet beneath the warmth, those closest to him could sense an awareness of approaching finality. He spoke more often of mortality, though never in fear. He regarded death not as an enemy, but as a companion long delayed. "I am ready to meet my Maker," he once said, "but whether my Maker is prepared for the great ordeal of meeting me is another matter." It was typical of him, solemn truth veiled in wit, gravity balanced by grace. The world beyond Chartwell was changing faster than even his vast perspective could fully absorb. The empire he had once served had become the Commonwealth. Nations he had known as colonies now stood independent. Britain itself was changing, younger, more modern, its memory of the war fading into history. To some, Churchill had become a symbol of a bygone age. To others, he remained the embodiment of endurance. He accepted both views without protest. He understood that each generation must fashion its own myths and heroes. What mattered to him was not his place within memory, but that the lessons of endurance, the necessity of courage, the duty of vigilance, the faith in freedom, would not be forgotten. In his quieter moments he turned increasingly inward. He read the classics, Gibbon, Shakespeare, and the historians of Greece and Rome. He drew comfort from their accounts of human struggle and renewal. History, he believed, was not progress in a straight line, but a long oscillation between light and shadow. Each age had its perils, its triumphs, its illusions. He had lived through more than one such cycle and saw in that continuity a reason for hope. "The farther backward you can look," he had once said, "the farther forward you are likely to see." Now, in his old age, he lived those words not as theory, but as peace. The past had become his companion, no longer a burden, but a quiet presence, guiding him toward acceptance. Clementine, his wife of many decades, remained by his side through these final years, the steadfast figure who had anchored his restless energy through storms of politics and war. Their bond, forged in youth and tested by distance and duty, endured as quietly as the turning seasons. They spoke less now, often sitting together in silence, sharing a companionship that needed no words. She tended to his comfort, protected his solitude, and watched with both pride and sorrow as his strength diminished. To her he owed not only support, but balance, the calm that had tempered his fire. In her presence, the great orator became simply a man, grateful for the constancy of love. Honours continued to find him, though he received them with increasing detachment. In 1953, he had been knighted by Queen Elizabeth II, becoming Sir Winston Churchill, a title that seemed to formalise what the world had long known. Yet he took more pleasure in the quiet letters sent by ordinary citizens, the notes of gratitude from those who had lived because his words had steadied them in darkness. He read them slowly, often aloud, as if confirming that the bond between leader and people, forged in the crucible of crisis, had not been broken by time. The decline of his health in the late 1950s and early 1960s was gradual but relentless. Strokes weakened his body, though his mind remained sharp, if slower. He spoke less often, moved more carefully, and withdrew further into the rhythm of reflection. Friends noticed that he seemed content. He had made his peace with both triumph and failure, recognizing that the two were inseparable. To one visitor, who expressed regret that he had not written more about his later years, he replied, "The story has been told." It was both understatement and truth. His life, stretched across 2 centuries, had already become part of the very history he had so often sought to understand. In his final months, he spoke little, spending long hours in the company of silence. Sometimes he would sit by the window, watching the sunset fall over the fields, his gaze distant but tranquil. To those who asked what he thought of in those moments, he would answer, "I think of the long journey, and the work still to be done." Even as his body failed, his sense of unfinished duty remained, but there was no longer urgency, only calm. The quiet certainty that the work he had begun would continue through others, that the spirit he had defended was larger than any single life. As 1965 began, his strength finally ebbed. The long voyage that had carried him through the battles of empire, the storms of politics, and the fires of war was drawing to a close. Britain, and indeed the world, watched in silence, knowing that an era was ending. The man who had lived at the very centre of history was now receding into it, slowly, peacefully, as though merging with the very continuity he had so often invoked. There was no grandeur in his decline, only dignity, the final expression of a life spent in service to endurance itself. In January of 1965, the long arc of Winston Churchill's life drew to its quiet conclusion. He was 90 years old, frail and largely silent, his once formidable frame now diminished. Yet even in stillness he seemed to retain the gravity of history itself. The world that surrounded him was unrecognizable from the one into which he had been born, a world of telegraphs and horse-drawn carriages, now replaced by satellites and atomic-age diplomacy. Yet in that same transformation lay the reflection of his own journey, from the twilight of empire to the dawn of a new world order. He had not merely witnessed the passing of an age, he had shaped its survival. As he lay in his London home at Hyde Park Gate, the nation held its breath, as though waiting not for the death of a man, but for the closing of an epoch. He slipped into unconsciousness on the 10th of January and remained so for 2 weeks, watched over by his family in reverent silence. The doctors could do little but wait, and so the world waited with them. Outside his home, people gathered, some who had fought in the war, some too young to remember it, but aware instinctively of the magnitude of what his presence had meant. Newspapers printed daily bulletins. Radio stations broadcast quiet updates. There was no hysteria, only an immense, shared solemnity. It was as though the country itself was keeping vigil, repaying in silence the voice that had once spoken for it in its darkest hour. On the morning of the 24th of January, exactly 70 years after his father's death, Winston Churchill passed away. The news spread slowly, reverently, across the world. Bells tolled across London, flags were lowered, and in every capital city, words of mourning were spoken in languages that only years before had been divided by war. To many, his death seemed to mark the final passing of the 19th century, the end of the long age of empire, chivalry, and the belief in personal destiny. Yet for others, it marked something simpler and more enduring, the farewell of a man who had personified courage when courage was most needed. The government, recognising the scale of his service, decreed that he should be honoured with a state funeral, the first for a commoner since the Duke of Wellington more than a century before. The preparations were carried out with precision and solemnity, following Churchill's own wishes. He had planned much of it years earlier with characteristic foresight, under the code name Operation Hope Not. The irony of that title, part jest, part prophecy, captured the essence of his character. Even in death, he retained the humour of defiance. On the 30th of January, under a pale winter sky, the funeral cortege made its way through London. The air was cold and still. Crowds lined the streets in their hundreds of thousands, yet no sound broke the silence but the steady rhythm of the drums, and the tolling of Big Ben struck mute after its final chime. Soldiers stood at attention, sailors lowered their flags, and old men saluted through tears. For many, it was not merely a farewell to Churchill, but to the memory of their own endurance. The generation that had lived through the war saw in his passing a mirror of their own journey, from terror to triumph, from youth to memory. The service at St. Paul's Cathedral was solemn and simple, attended by representatives from more than 100 nations. The great dome that had withstood the Blitz now echoed with the hymns of peace. As the coffin, draped in the Union flag, rested beneath the light filtering through the high windows, the choir sang the words of Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The congregation, among them kings, presidents, soldiers and citizens, bowed their heads together in silence. Outside, the city stood motionless. For a few brief hours, London, so often the stage of his struggles and his victories, became a sanctuary of reflection. After the service, the coffin was borne down the Thames, the river that had carried the lifeblood of the empire he had once defended. As the funeral barge passed beneath the bridges, dock workers and sailors stood atop cranes and masts, saluting in stillness. The flags of ships were dipped in tribute, and the cranes themselves, as if moved by invisible command, bowed their steel necks one by one in solemn unison. The image, simple and wordless, became one of the most enduring of the century. The machinery of industry, bowing to the man who had spoken for the spirit within it. From there, his journey continued by train to Bladon, near Blenheim Palace, where he had been born. It was fitting that his life should end where it had begun, amid the quiet fields of Oxfordshire. The small village church, modest and serene, received him with simplicity. As his coffin was lowered into the ground beside his parents, a shaft of winter sunlight broke through the clouds, falling briefly across the grave. It was not spectacle, but serenity, the final punctuation to a life lived in the service of endurance. In the days that followed, tributes poured in from around the world. Roosevelt's successor in America called him the greatest Englishman of our time. The French president described him as the liberator of the human spirit. In Moscow, even those who had once been his adversaries spoke his name with respect. Yet beyond the grandeur of such words, there was a deeper, quieter recognition among ordinary people that Churchill had been not only a statesman, but a companion. His strength had been shared, his courage had been borrowed, his words had become the measure of their own endurance. In the years since his passing, his image has been examined, debated and reinterpreted, as all great figures are. His errors, his stubbornness, his imperial loyalties, all have been studied with the distance that time affords. Yet through every revision, one truth endures, that he embodied in moments of peril the resilience of humanity itself. His greatness was not perfection, but persistence, the ability to hold fast when all else seemed lost. He believed that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it, that the true strength of a nation lay not in power, but in resolve. Those beliefs, once spoken in the shadow of ruin, still echo in the language of freedom today. In the long perspective of history, Churchill stands not as a monument of certainty, but as a symbol of endurance. His life spanned revolutions of technology and thought, yet through all change he held fast to the conviction that the human spirit could outlast its trials. The empire to which he devoted his youth has vanished. The world order he defended has transformed. Yet the example of his courage, that calm defiance in the face of darkness, remains. He once wrote that history will be kind to me, for I intend to write it. And he did. But history, in turn, has been kind to him not because he wrote it, but because he lived it with purpose, dignity, and an unbroken faith in the capacity of mankind to endure. And so his story ends not in grandeur, but in reflection. The statesman, the soldier, the orator, the writer, all recede into the greater figure of the man who refused despair. His voice, once the rallying cry of nations, has fallen silent, yet its echo remains, steady, measured, and eternal. The tides of history continue to rise and fall, new challenges appear, and new generations take up the burdens he once bore. But the lesson he left endures, that courage, tempered by humility, can preserve the world, that endurance, guided by faith, can outlast even the darkest night. And in that lesson, Winston Churchill lives still, not as a relic of the past, but as a voice within it, reminding humanity of what it is capable of when it chooses not to yield.